Chapter 23:15. An abstract, illusory figure replaced the fragment and became an abstract attribute of the cultivation method. It appeared in the depths of the cultivation method. After this figure appeared, the words and diagrams on the cultivation method underwent some subtle changes. There seemed to be some sort of indescribable profundity. It was as if just by looking at those positions and diagrams, one could comprehend some sort of abstruse truth. This kind of change instantly made Luo Fan feel that his fragment had finally reached the level where his own thoughts could be stationed in it. With this change, his heart moved slightly, and the three-eyed, four-elbowed figure formed by the fragment began to move. At the same time, the primordial being also felt the change in the cultivation method. In just an instant, he discovered that he had comprehended countless things that he had never been able to comprehend before from the cultivation method. His understanding of cultivation and his understanding of the world had undergone an earth-shattering change. Under this change, his strength began to rise rapidly. In just the blink of an eye, his cultivation had advanced by a level, and he was faintly approaching the level of Khanate Grand Luo. When he discovered this improvement, the primordial being was even more certain that his choice was correct. His methods of conquering the many living beings in the world became more and more violent, causing the other living beings to suffer even more. However, although he was the primordial being, and his strength was the strongest in the world, this did not mean that he would be able to push through everything. No power could stop him. As his methods became more and more violent and his attitude became more and more arrogant, more and more living beings became dissatisfied with him. This dissatisfaction caused them to band together more and more. They formed alliances that specialized in fighting against the primordial being. After these alliances were formed, they naturally caused great trouble for the primordial being. This caused his process of conquering to be unable to be as smooth as before. After these alliances were formed, they naturally caused great trouble for the primordial being. This caused his process of conquering to be unable to be as smooth as before. This naturally caused the primordial being to be extremely dissatisfied. As a result, he started to focus on these alliances. This instead gave the other living beings a chance to catch their breath. This allowed them to see the primordial being's methods more clearly. Naturally, they became even more wary of the primordial being, and their desire to band together became even stronger. Just like that, the number of alliances kept popping up like bamboo shoots after the rain. Even if that primordial being continued to collect cultivation techniques, making those cultivation techniques more and more exquisite, it also made itself stronger and stronger. However, in the end, he still had to fight against all the living beings in this world. Even though he was almost invincible, he still encountered more and more trouble in the continuous resistance. His originally powerful advantage became weaker and weaker. In the end, after tens of thousands of years, he was finally forced to the place where he was born under the joint operation of many alliances. They surrounded him. Due to the pressure from the most outstanding living beings, the many resisting living beings also stimulated their own strength. The various cultivation techniques that were originally incompatible with each other also began to fuse together. As a result, compared to tens of thousands of years ago, the cultivation system in this world was thousands of times more complicated and exquisite. On the other hand, living beings that were at most at the third level of the earthly immortal realm had unknowingly obtained great improvements. Now, the strongest living being had even barely stepped into the primordial pure yang level. Compared to the primordial being, even though there was still a huge gap between them, they could be considered to be on the same level in the end. Compared to the past, they were much better. It was precisely because their strength had improved greatly that they were able to achieve this at this moment, forcing the primordial being to the place where he was born, and he was about to be destroyed. Facing such a terrible situation, the primordial being sighed inwardly. In the end, I still can't unify all the cultivation techniques, he muttered. His gaze towards the many living beings had lost its original disdain and arrogance, and there was only a deep sense of regret. The other living beings naturally didn't pay attention to his words. No matter what the primordial being's objective was, his actions had already brought them great harm. They definitely couldn't let him go just because he had a noble objective. At this moment, one of the living beings said, "Die! Demon! Kill! Kill! Kill!" Loud battle cries erupted and surged towards the primordial being like a surging wave, directly drowning him. Seeing this, the primordial being restrained all his emotions and sneered, "Do you think you've already won? I'll show you what I'm capable of now." He roared, and a raging flame suddenly soared from his body. This kind of flame was extremely mysterious. Although it was illusory, it seemed to have substance. As it burned in the void, it drew endless laws towards it, causing the flames to evaporate and change, producing all sorts of transformations that left all the living beings in the surroundings dumbfounded. Countless figures were born from the flames, covering the sky and earth as they pounced towards the many living beings. Some of these figures were living beings with natural Tao bodies in this world, while others looked like living beings that had been born in this world over the years. However, no matter what they looked like, their essence was that strange flame. Moreover, their strength was definitely not much weaker than their original bodies. Some were even several times stronger than their original bodies due to the support of the flames. In just a few short breaths, more than 1,000,000 figures swarmed out of the flames. Even at this point, the flames still continued to release many living beings. It was as if there was an extremely vast world within the flames. When had the living beings besieging the primordial being ever seen such a method? For a moment they were all flustered. All they could do was use everything they had to block the countless figures pouncing towards them and disintegrate their attacks. This battle between the primordial being and the various alliances lasted for 100 years. In the end, even though the primordial being was powerful and had brilliant methods, it was still outnumbered. Under the encirclement of so many living beings, its methods were destroyed, its source of power was disintegrated, and the flames burning on its body were extinguished by the endless power. Its body also completely collapsed under the intense attacks, turning into powder and vanishing without a trace. We finally succeeded. After seeing the primordial being turn into powder and vanish without a trace, the other living beings finally believed that the primordial being was finished, and all of them heaved sighs of relief. After such a long siege, it seemed like they had obtained the final victory. However, only they themselves knew how difficult the entire process was. Not to mention anything else, just based on the number of deaths alone, more than half of the besiegers had been killed by the primordial being during those hundreds of years, and not even a single trace was left behind. In this way, no matter how arrogant they were, they had to admit that the primordial being was powerful. The many living beings of the Alliance lay on the ground, and they were all relaxing themselves to recover from the exhaustion accumulated from the long battle. Not long after, a strange light suddenly appeared at the place where the primordial being had died. The strange light was like a bolt from the blue to the many living beings who had just broken free from the oppression of the primordial spirit race. Almost all of the living beings instantly sprang up and looked at the light with great caution in their eyes. After all, the terror of the primordial being was still fresh in their minds. Under such circumstances, after the primordial being had disappeared, anything that appeared at its location would naturally make them suspect that the primordial being hadn't completely died and was now planning to make a comeback. In this case, it would be strange if they didn't overreact. However, when they were all prepared, they realized that the light was not the primordial being's comeback at all. It was clearly a scroll that constantly emitted an extremely mysterious light that seemed to contain all the mysteries of the universe. The scroll floated in the air, and the light on it expanded and contracted as if it was sucking in something. The laws of the world were constantly responding to the light and the frequency at which it expanded and contracted. At a glance, it seemed like the space-time around the scroll was undergoing some kind of indescribable change, which made the scroll seem even more mysterious. Seeing the scroll, some living beings with sharp minds already thought of something. A greedy emotion emerged from the depths of their eyes. This scroll must be the cultivation method of the primordial being. If I obtain it, won't I be able to become a powerhouse like the primordial being? This thought instantly appeared in the minds of many living beings. It should be said that although they were enemies with the primordial being, it was because the primordial being wanted to conquer them and obtain their cultivation method. In their hearts, they still admitted that the primordial being was a powerhouse that was far more powerful than they were. Under such circumstances, when they discovered that the source of the primordial being's strength had appeared before them, how could they suppress their greed? For a time, an invisible barrier suddenly appeared between the many alliances that were originally working closely together. They looked at each other with vigilance and warning in their eyes. The originally relaxed and harmonious atmosphere had completely disappeared in the blink of an eye, replaced by a strange silence. Finally, one of the creatures couldn't resist the temptation of the scroll being placed right in front of him. He roared, "If you don't want it, I want it." As he spoke, he dashed towards the scroll. Although this creature's actions were triggered by the impulse in the bottom of its heart, it could not move at all. But that didn't mean he was a complete fool. Since he dared to be the first to make a move, he naturally had his own confidence. The source of his confidence was none other than his speed. Before he could finish his sentence, he had already arrived in front of the glowing scroll and reached out to grab it. Seeing that the scroll was about to fall into his hands and fly far away with him, at that moment, cold harumphs rang out. Hundreds of terrifying forces blasted from all directions and landed on the creature's body. As the creature screamed in agony, its entire body collapsed completely. Not even a single fragment was left. Among the many creatures in the surroundings, hundreds of them attacked at the same time. They attacked the creature that planned to take the scroll for itself while everyone else was in a standoff. Although the creature wasn't weak, it was only at the same level as the other creatures. How could it withstand such an attack? It was perfectly normal for it to be destroyed. As the living being was destroyed, the other living beings looked at each other even more warily. The creatures that had planned to fish in troubled waters completely dispelled their original plans. They shrank their heads like quails and didn't dare to move anymore. Even if it thought it was stronger than the creature that had tried to snatch the scroll, it wasn't confident that it could remain unscathed under the attacks of so many people. If it didn't have this confidence, how could it have dared to risk its life? Although the creature's actions were abrupt, it was like a fuse that finally exposed the hidden hostility between everyone. At this moment, the life forms no longer concealed their enmity towards each other. Every single one of them looked at each other with great caution, looking at the other alliances that they believed to be comparable to them in strength. Just like that, the alliances that had originally planned to form alliances also began to link up without any reservations. They wanted to make their side the strongest and completely suppress everyone else. They wanted to occupy that ancient book for themselves, or rather, share that ancient book for themselves. After all, the number of living beings in the alliance wasn't the only one. As they linked up, in just a few days, the many alliances that had surrounded the original creature turned into 13 alliances that were of equal strength. None of them could suppress the other. These 13 alliances were divided into 13 directions and surrounded the scroll. Each of them guarded one direction of the scroll and were vigilant of the other 12 alliances to prevent the other forces from seizing the opportunity to snatch the scroll away. Of course, they were also looking for an opportunity to snatch the scroll away from the other forces. Chapter 23:16. How can you tell that the first spirit cultivated the Tao of fire? What he used at the end wasn't fire at all. It was merely a form of burning power. At most, it just means that he used his power to the limit, another creature retorted. Next, a large group of living beings argued that the cultivation method suited them the most and that it wasn't as suitable for them as it was for others. As a result, the area became extremely noisy, as if it had turned into a market. The result was obvious. After all, this cultivation method was very likely the reason why the first spirit could slaughter the world. How could they give up on this cultivation method? The more they argued, the more agitated they became. The shadow of war loomed over them. It seemed like the world was about to descend into war again. At that moment, a creature that still had some sense left made a suggestion. That all living beings should share this cultivation method. After all, this was a cultivation method, not some other treasure. All living beings needed to do was read and memorize it. They didn't need to take the scroll for themselves. In other words, sharing the scroll wouldn't reduce the gains of those who could have taken it. Many living beings were unwilling to accept this suggestion. They didn't want war, but they didn't want this cultivation method to become commonplace either. After all, a large part of the reason why cultivation methods were so profound was because they were mysterious. If they became commonplace, then the mysteriousness within would naturally be greatly weakened. As a result, for those who obtained this cultivation method, the cultivation method that could have allowed them to soar into the sky and slaughter the world might instead become something similar to a basic cultivation method. How could they be willing to accept this? Under this kind of unwillingness and unwillingness to fight, the scene fell into silence. Every living being was pondering which choice would be the most beneficial to them. For different living beings, the danger of war was different. Those powerful creatures were far more resilient to the dangers of war than those weaker creatures. Because of this difference, living beings of different strengths and weaknesses would make different choices after thinking about it. At that moment, the living beings were divided into two camps. One was determined to monopolize the cultivation method, while the other was willing to share the cultivation method. As for the 13 alliances that they had spent so much time and effort to form, they had completely disintegrated. All of the living beings were scattered and merged into the two camps. The difference in strength between the two camps was extremely strange, but they were equally matched. Although the beings who intended to enjoy the cultivation method for themselves were much stronger than those who were willing to share, they were still much stronger. However, in any part of the world, experts were only a small part of it. In the end, the true masses were those who weren't too strong or too weak in this world. It was naturally the same. Even though the beings who wanted to keep the cultivation method to themselves were the most powerful beings in this world, their numbers couldn't compare to the cultivators who were willing to share. In this way, when the two camps were compared, the strength of the two sides naturally became balanced again. This balance caused both sides to have misgivings. They didn't dare to rashly start a war again. After all, they had just survived the battle with the most powerful being. How terrifying was that battle! The effects it had on the sex were enormous. Even now, they were still extremely afraid. Even if one side could easily suppress the other, they would still hesitate. Moreover, the strength of both sides was roughly equal. As they hesitated, thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. During these thousands of years, the world gradually recovered. The living beings that died in the previous war began to reappear in the world in various forms. Some were reincarnated, while others were directly born from the corpses of a new generation of living beings. As these new beings were born, the factions that were willing to share began to strengthen. After all, to these new beings, even if they were talented and had great potential, they still didn't have enough time to develop. Naturally, their strength couldn't surpass most living beings. If they wanted to obtain the cultivation method that was said to have been painstakingly created by the first living beings, they could only join the factions that were willing to share. In this manner, as time passed, the entire situation began to gradually lose its balance. In the end, at a certain moment, the living beings that wanted to monopolize the cultivation method realized that something was wrong. They knew that if they continued to delay, what awaited them would be complete failure. Therefore, no matter how afraid they were of war, they could only start the war first and directly pounce on the opposing faction. As they moved, the world finally fell into chaos again. Moreover, although the first living beings were no longer there, the war this time was even more intense than the war against the first living beings. The destructive power was even greater. After all, even though the primordial being was powerful back then, it was all alone. How much damage could they cause with such strength and numbers when they were almost at the level of Khanate Grand Luo? However, it was completely different now. Currently, there were hundreds of millions of people fighting each other at the same time. The distribution of the battles was extremely vast, so the destructive power was naturally considerable. The terrain of the entire world began to change rapidly in this war. It was to the extent that even the laws of the world and the great Tao seemed to be faintly showing some subtle changes due to the development of the war. This war went on for tens of thousands of years. In the end, both sides suffered great losses. Whether it was the faction that wanted to monopolize the cultivation method or the faction that wanted to share it, none of them won in the end. The cultivation method was not obtained by any faction. Instead, it was taken by a living being that was born out of thin air in that location over tens of thousands of years. This living being was extremely strange. Although he had just been born, he already had the ability to suppress everything and make all living beings in this world submit to him. The moment he was born, he directly grabbed the scroll and absorbed all of its content. In the end, he even destroyed the scroll completely. It was also his birth that stopped this super large-scale war that had been going on for tens of thousands of years. "Who are you?" At this moment, roars of shock and anger surged towards this living being from all directions. They had been fighting with their lives on the line, but in the end, the thing they were fighting for had been taken away by something of unknown origin. How could they accept this? If it wasn't for the fact that they could intuitively sense how powerful this living being before them was, they would not be shouting at him, but attacking him mercilessly. Faced with this kind of shouting, the figure smiled faintly and said, "You can call me the source of the cultivation method, or you can call me Luo Fan." As he said this, the entire world rumbled, as if something extremely sturdy had been shattered in an instant. Following this loud rumble, countless rays of light appeared above the figure's head. There were also countless strange lights and shadows revolving around the figure, constantly changing. Vaguely, an aura that transcended everything and stood above everything spread out from the figure's body. At this moment, all the living beings understood that the world was completely different from before. The days when they had decided the situation of the world and the safety of the world were gone, never to return. This figure was none other than Luo Fan's fragment. Luo Fan's fragment was just an abstract attribute of the cultivation method, so it was impossible for such a change to happen. But unfortunately, his mind was still intact. His wisdom, his memories, and all of his other cultivation achievements were still there. Under such circumstances, how could he be satisfied with this state of being an abstract attribute of the cultivation method? Naturally, he would use all his methods to think of ways to escape this awkward situation so that he could regain his freedom and obtain a chance to grow and improve himself. Although it seemed inconceivable to do this, it was actually not difficult from a fundamental point of view. It was nothing more than the process of ordinary animals, plants, or inanimate objects cultivating and becoming spirits. If there was anything different, it would only be the difference in the amount of energy absorbed. If other animals, plants, or even inanimate objects wanted to cultivate and become spirits, they needed to absorb endless vitality from the outside world to refine and transform themselves. In the end, they would be able to transcend their original nature and transform from animals, plants, and inanimate objects into monsters. As for him, he was just an abstract attribute. If he wanted to strengthen himself, he could only continuously absorb the abstract attributes of other cultivation methods. This was somewhat similar to what the original living being had done. However, the original living being's goal was for the cultivation method. Fusing with the abstract attribute was only a secondary side effect. As for him, he did it for the abstract attribute. The cultivation method itself was instead a side effect. As for how he did it, it was even simpler. He achieved his goal through the war that was stirred up by the many living beings. One must know that the best medium for cultivation methods was not inanimate objects, but living beings. There might be mistakes and omissions in the cultivation methods of dead beings. However, unless the living being wanted to commit suicide, the cultivation methods that it carried would never have any mistakes or omissions. Under normal circumstances, although some of these cultivation methods were revealed, most of them were still hidden. Even if they were to read living beings, they would only obtain broken fragments. However, this situation was completely different in a war. In a war, in order to survive and to win, all living beings could only use their own cultivation methods to the limit. They would activate their own potential to the limit. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan did not even need to read them. Those cultivation methods would naturally seep into the scroll that his fragment was attached to, thus promoting his growth. In this way, as the war continued, Luo Fan's fragment naturally gained more and more benefits. In the end, he was able to break the shackles of his nature in a short period of tens of thousands of years. He broke away from the restrictions of the abstract attribute and transcended to become the spiritual monster that he was today. Given his realm, as long as he could obtain freedom, he would naturally be able to unleash his own power to an unimaginable effect. Moreover, his current appearance was based on the abstract attribute of the cultivation methods of countless other living beings, and he could form a fundamental suppression on those living beings. In this way, it was only natural that he would form such a suppression on the living beings, causing them to be so wary of him. The source of cultivation, Luo Fan? Many living beings could not help but look at each other. This answer was beyond their understanding. The last word was just two ordinary words. The name that they formed was at most a form of address. It was not much at all. However, the first word was enough to make their imaginations roam. The source of cultivation. Could it be that all the cultivation methods originated from him? Or could it be that the source of all the cultivation methods could actually be found from him? All sorts of chaotic thoughts caused many living beings to fall into silence. However, Luo Fan did not pay attention to them at this moment. He merely smiled and waved his hand. The surrounding space-time underwent an earth-shattering change. In the blink of an eye, an incomparably majestic palace appeared under his feet. This palace was extremely strange. It was densely engraved with countless runes, talismans, words, and diagrams. As soon as these runes, talismans, words, and diagrams appeared, many living beings who could see this scene were dumbfounded. They felt that their thoughts had stopped. It was because every single one of them could see a certain characteristic of their own cultivation methods from these countless engravings. It was as if their own cultivation methods had been scattered and fused into these engravings. From today onward, I will be lecturing in this origin of cultivation hall. All living beings can come and listen. Luo Fan chuckled and slowly descended into the huge palace below. Meanwhile, the countless strange phenomena that were originally attached to his body turned and attached themselves to the incomparably majestic palace, making the palace seem even more sacred, mysterious, and unbelievable. At this moment, how could those living beings still care about the ongoing war? Almost all of them subconsciously headed toward the hall. They wanted to get closer to the hall and see the engravings more clearly. Chapter 23:17. The reason why these living beings did not enter the palace was very simple. It was because the palace's door was still tightly shut. The palace's door was not open. Even if they were extremely eager to enter and listen to the existence that was said to be the origin of the method, they did not dare to do anything. They could only obediently stand outside the palace and observe the countless runes, talismans, words, and diagrams engraved on the palace to comprehend the mysteries of cultivation they needed. These living beings had been waiting here for several years. When the number of living beings around the palace reached an uncountable number, it felt as if all the living beings in the world had gathered here. Only then did the palace change a little. The innumerable runes, talismans, words, and diagrams engraved on the palace began to squirm slightly. Specks of strange and mysterious light began to surface from the innumerable engravings. As these engravings squirmed, they began to undergo various indescribable changes, causing these engravings to become increasingly mysterious, profound, and inconceivable to the many living beings paying attention to the engravings. This change was extremely obvious. For a time, many living beings cried out in surprise, and their expressions became nervous and expectant. Under these circumstances, the countless engravings gradually gathered at the palace's door, causing the palace's door to look like a huge light source that was inexplicably dazzling. Shortly after, a creaking sound came from the door. As the sound rang out, the light began to gradually split apart and retract. In the end, when the sound completely disappeared, the door suddenly opened. A vast and boundless starry sky appeared in the senses of all living beings through the door. At this moment, many living beings cheered in the face of such a change. Like flowing water, they began to rush towards the palace in a frenzy. This palace was extremely large, but in the end it was still a palace. Based on its external size, accommodating millions of people was probably its limit. However, at this moment, the number of living beings that had surged into the palace had exceeded 10 million in the blink of an eye, but the palace was still not full. Looking from the outside, it was still a boundless starry sky. It was impossible to see the end of it, and it was even impossible to see where the living beings that had entered the palace had gone to. It was as if there really was a boundless starry sky inside. This situation was naturally nothing much to other worlds that had perfected their cultivation systems. However, to this world where the cultivation system was not perfected yet and all living beings only knew how to fumble around in ignorance, it was already like a miracle, causing the countless living beings to be extremely shocked. At this moment, some of the sharper ones compared this method to the final method that the primordial lifeform had displayed. They vaguely felt that the origin of this method had an extremely close connection with the primordial lifeform. After all, if there was no such connection, why did this method seem so similar to the primordial lifeform's final method? In the end, who knew how many living beings gathered in the surroundings, regardless of whether they were big or small, all entered the palace. Not a single one remained outside. The entire world seemed to be empty, as if only this palace was left originally. The vast area around the palace, which felt like it was hundreds of millions of miles in radius, was now completely gone. When all the creatures had entered the palace, the gate of the palace reappeared and began to slowly close together, turning back into the gate of the palace, isolating the inside and outside of the palace. As the gate closed, the originally empty world seemed to become even more empty and desolate. However, the situation inside the palace was vastly different from the situation outside. At the center of the boundless starry sky within the palace, there was a huge platform that seemed to suppress the starry sky. On this high platform, Luo Fan's fragment was sitting cross-legged. His entire body was emitting a boundless brilliance, stirring the starry sky and condensing into countless strange lights and shadows, making him look incomparably noble, incomparably divine, and even more like omnipotent. In all directions of this high platform, an unknown number of billions of living beings sat cross-legged, spreading out to the limits of one's vision. The number was so great that it surpassed any of the targets that Luo Fan had visited in the past. This starry sky was just as it looked from the outside. It was boundless. If it was not for the fact that Luo Fan was the creator of this palace and the master of this entire starry sky, perhaps even he would not know where the end of this starry sky was. Seeing that all the living beings had sat down, the fragment of Luo Fan did not waste any time. He directly began to preach what he understood, the origin of cultivation in this world, and the abstract attributes of the countless cultivation methods that he had absorbed. As he preached, the entire starry sky gradually emitted a strange glow that enveloped all the living beings. A strange fragrance appeared out of thin air and continuously poured into the nostrils of the countless living beings who were listening to him, causing the power in their bodies to undergo some subtle changes. It was as if the speed and method of circulation were undergoing some kind of indescribable adjustment, becoming more and more profound, more and more exquisite, and more incredible. At a glance, Luo Fan could see that the abstract attributes of the cultivation methods that they carried with them were also beginning to grow indescribably. Seeing this kind of growth, he naturally did not hold back. While he continued to cultivate, he also continuously absorbed these abstract attributes and continuously gathered them on himself. Amidst such changes, his body was also constantly fusing with more fragments, allowing his body to obtain more and grow even more. It must be known that similar to the abstract attributes of the cultivation methods of the first living being, his other fragments were also abstract attributes of the cultivation methods of other cultivators. Fusing with other abstract attributes was actually equivalent to extracting other fragments and fusing them into oneself. In this way, he would naturally be able to continuously grow. This method of using one's own understanding of the mysteries of cultivation to nurture other living beings, and then absorbing the abstract attributes of their cultivation methods, seemed a little impossible. After all, in the end, it all depended on one's own understanding. It felt like he was absorbing something that he had spat out. However, in reality, this situation could not be any more natural. His method was actually similar to breeding. If it was breeding, he would also feed the resources he obtained to the animals he bred and nurture them. When the animals grew to a certain stage, he would then kill and eat the meat of the animals or sell them. What was the essential difference between this kind of behavior and what Luo Fan was doing now? Could it be said that breeding animals to eat meat was like absorbing something that they had spat out? For all living beings in this world, this sexual intercourse was almost a fortuitous opportunity that they could not even dream of. During the process of Luo Fan's sexual intercourse, they could almost feel their own growth at every moment. They could feel that their horizons were broadening, and they could feel that their understanding of cultivation and the world was changing. For a time, every living being was intoxicated and immersed in the cultivation atmosphere that Luo Fan had created. This sexual intercourse lasted for 30,000 years. After 30,000 years, Luo Fan felt that the current potential of all living beings had been completely stimulated. Their cultivation methods could no longer be improved. At least, with their current foundation, they could no longer make any progress. In the end, they could only helplessly stop the process of sexual intercourse. At this time, among the living beings who were listening to his sexual intercourse, the weakest one had already reached the level of an itinerant immortal. The strongest one had even touched the edge of the quasi-saint realm and reached the peak of the connate zenith heaven. In comparison, the fragment in the center of the starry sky had unknowingly completed the gathering of nearly 30% of the fragments. His cultivation realm had also recovered to the level of a false saint. In this state, if he was willing, he could completely wipe out the countless living beings in this palace at this moment with just a thought. However, it was obvious that he would not kill the goose that laid the golden eggs. At this moment, he only said, "This sexual intercourse ends here. The next one will be in 300 million years. If everyone is fated, you can come and listen at that time." As he said this, a mysterious power appeared out of nowhere and acted on the countless living beings in the palace. In a flash, they had already left the palace and arrived outside the palace, causing the world outside the palace to suddenly become lively. Before the living beings could react, the palace that had existed in this location for tens of thousands of years had gradually become blurry. Not long after, it completely disappeared, leaving only an empty flat ground in the center of the crowd. It reflected everyone's confused and reluctant expressions. This was because Luo Fan had directly sent the palace into a space-time that existed between reality and illusion, making it impossible for any living beings to find it. The living beings were confused for a long time before gradually coming back to their senses. Immediately afterwards, the living beings started to bow in the direction where the palace had disappeared. They secretly thanked Luo Fan for his kindness in their own ways. Afterwards, the living beings dispersed one by one and returned to their territories. It could be predicted that the world would become extremely chaotic in the following period of time. Battles would definitely occur between the living beings and the new living beings that had been born in this world for tens of thousands of years. There would definitely be more and more conflicts and friction between these living beings. Amidst such conflicts and friction, a new order of the world would gradually appear. Luo Fan, who was hidden in the palace, was very clear about all of this, and he was looking forward to all of these developments. After all, to him, all the conflicts in this world represented the awakening of the wisdom of living beings. They represented that living beings were gathering their foundations. Even if living beings died, it was just a normal cycle of reincarnation. After carefully observing the development of this world for a period of time and discovering that the development of this world was no different from what he had expected, Luo Fan, the fragment, began to think about his own problems. Currently, he was already walking on the path to heaven that connected the countless fragments that had been shattered by this world. It could be predicted that although it would take a long time, there would be a day when he would completely gather all the fragments and restore himself to the appearance of the fragment that had entered this world. However, when that time came, it would be the start of his game with this world. If it was as he had expected, once he gathered all the fragments and restored himself to his original appearance, the world would definitely use some method that he still could not imagine to attack him. If he could not withstand this attack, he would probably fall into the same situation as before. The fragment would be shattered once more and return to a state that he could not understand. It was even to the extent that it was unlikely for it to return to the abstract attributes of the cultivation method. Instead, it would be transformed into an even more mysterious and obscure state. And if he wanted to break this fate, the only way was to withstand the attack from the heavens and earth. Only by withstanding the attack could his fragment continue to exist in this world and even continue to grow. Only then would he have the qualifications to talk about transcending this world and breaking the shackles of this world. Only then would he have the qualifications to talk about passing the sixth Great Tribulation. And this was only what he had encountered in one of the countless trillions of worlds. Out of the countless trillions of worlds, every single one of them had a fragment of him. And the experiences of every fragment were similar to what his fragment had encountered in this world. In this way, if he wanted to truly pass the sixth Great Tribulation, the difficulty would be far more terrifying than any of the Great Tribulations he had overcome in the past. As expected of the difficulty of a Great Tribulation, Luo Fan could not help but sigh as he imagined the difficulty of the entire process. Chapter 23:18. Under Luo Fan's observation, the situation in the perfect world of the three-eyed, four-elbow-shaped humanoid creature with the Kane Taoism aptitude gradually began to develop. After the living beings who had listened to Luo Fan's teachings returned to their respective territories, they began to fight with the newly born living beings in their territories in an attempt to reclaim their territories. This was because they had obtained great benefits from Luo Fan's teachings, and they were much more powerful than before. Compared to these newly born living beings, they were much more powerful. Therefore, this kind of war was only a simple matter for them. In the end, the scale of the war was also limited to a relatively small area. The situation in the world seemed to be only sporadic turbulence at this time, however, as the living beings gradually integrated the benefits they had gained from listening to Luo Fan's teachings with their own bodies, and as they gradually digested the foundation they had accumulated, the situation in the world began to change. Cultivation required resources. This was especially true for those living beings who were unable to be self-sufficient. Their demand for resources was even greater. After they sorted out their gains, it was inevitable that they would seek external resources to nurture and strengthen themselves. Even if the world was vast and boundless, for living beings, what they could come into contact with, what they could develop, and what they could seize was definitely limited. As a result, more and more living beings sought resources from the outside world, which naturally triggered more and more conflicts. As the conflicts continued to accumulate, war was inevitable. After Luo Fan stopped his teachings, or rather, after the sporadic wars in which the living beings reclaimed their territories, the world had only been peaceful for about 100,000 years. After 100,000 years, all kinds of battles began to break out everywhere in the world. In the beginning, there were only sporadic battles, which could only make the world livelier at most. However, as time passed, as the conflicts and the demand for resources became more and more irreconcilable, the battles became more and more intense. In the end, after a certain period of development, the scale of the battles finally reached the scale of the wars that had covered the entire world in the past. Moreover, because the living beings were many times more powerful than before, the impact of the battles was much greater than before. Naturally, it wasn't enough to say that the heavens were falling and the earth was splitting. However, it was very common for mountains and rivers to be overturned. In this kind of war, the environment, the terrain, and even the meteorological phenomena were all greatly damaged. Vaguely, an indescribable baleful aura began to accumulate in the air. As the battle progressed, the baleful aura grew thicker and more violent. It had even vaguely covered the heavens and earth, causing the entire world to darken even more. Luo Fan, on the other hand, was observing the development of the world. Compared to the muddled and ignorant living beings of the heavens and the earth, he was extremely clearly aware that the development of the heavens and the earth was actually the sign of the impending calamity of the heavens and the earth. After all, although this world was not a truly perfect world, it was merely a world created by his sixth great tribulation. It was based on a perfect world in the state of chaos as a template. However, it was still a perfect heaven and earth after all. Since it was a perfect heaven and earth, it would naturally experience all sorts of things that a perfect heaven and earth should experience. For example, when a perfect heaven and earth grew into a great heaven and earth, it would inevitably encounter 9 great tribulations. Originally, he was actually happy to see the many living beings in this world fight against each other. After all, the more intense the battles between these living beings, the more profound their understanding of their own cultivation system and cultivation methods would be. During this process, the growth of those cultivation methods would naturally increase. In this way, he would naturally be able to absorb more of the abstract attributes of these cultivation methods. However, as the signs of the great calamity of the heavens and the earth appeared, he could no longer maintain this attitude. After all, even if it was only the first time a great calamity of the heavens and the earth appeared, it could still pose a great threat to the existence of the heavens and the earth itself. Although he was many times stronger than the living beings in this world, he had not reached a level where he could compare to the heavens and the earth. If the heavens and the earth were to fall and collapse in the great calamity of the heavens and the earth, what awaited him would probably be a disaster of destruction. In a situation where he could not be sure what impact this fragment of his would have after suffering a disaster of destruction, and how he would understand the process of his tribulation, how could he just watch things develop to that stage? However, something like a great calamity of the heavens and the earth was not something that could come and go as he pleased. Since there were already signs, then the eruption was almost inevitable now. The only thing that Luo Fan could do was to help this world survive the first great calamity of the heavens and the earth that would appear in an unknown period of time. After figuring out what he had to do, He did not hesitate and immediately began to send out strands of information from the palace that existed between reality and illusion. The information landed in the hearts of countless living beings in the world. This information did not contain any profound mysteries or principles of cultivation. There was only one type of information. That was an introduction to the 9 great calamities that a perfect heaven and earth needed to encounter. This kind of introduction instantly changed the entire situation of this world. It must be known that although Luo Fan did not exaggerate the horror of the great calamity of the heavens and the earth, just the description of the possible consequences of failure in the great calamity of the heavens and earth, and even the possible scenes of the great calamities that he had experienced in the past, was enough to make the scalps of all the living beings go numb and fill their hearts with fear. How can we survive such a calamity? The thoughts that appeared in the hearts of all the living beings were bordering on despair. Under the guidance of Luo Fan's message, they finally discovered what they had originally overlooked: the indescribably faint evil spirit that was continuously accumulating between the heavens and the earth. At this moment, they finally realized what kind of dangerous situation they were in. One could see the unimaginable danger in that evil spirit just by looking at it. If they waited for it to truly erupt, what kind of tragic fate would await them? For a moment, the enemy that they originally disliked suddenly became extremely pleasing to the eye. The conflict that could only be settled after a life-and-death battle had become so insignificant at this moment. We must unite. This was the thought that emerged in most of the living beings' minds when they sensed the almost irresistible danger. Of course, that was only the majority. However, there was still a small portion of the living beings who didn't want to ally with others. Instead, they just wanted to throw caution to the wind. They only wanted to vent the dissatisfaction and pressure that had accumulated in their hearts. With this mentality, they instead attacked other living beings with all their might and destroyed this part of the world. Facing such a change, the living beings who were worried about the great calamity that was about to befall this world were both angry and panicked. They were angry because those living beings who threw caution to the wind actually disregarded everything and didn't care about the situation of this world at all. On the other hand, they were panicking because their actions were like ruthlessly kicking this world into an abyss. How could they not panic under such circumstances? With one side having misgivings while the other side had already thrown caution to the wind, the situation of this world began to rapidly deteriorate. Before the great calamity could finish brewing, the entire world had already sunk into a state that was 100 times more chaotic than before. Fortunately, Luo Fan was up there to control everything. Looking at the living beings who became hysterical and threw caution to the wind, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. He didn't expect these living beings' wills to be so fragile. They couldn't even withstand the pressure of this calamity. His previous warning instead became a death knell for this part of the world. After thinking about it for a while, he finally understood what the root of this problem was. In actuality, the reason why there were so many living beings with such fragile minds was because of him. After all, Luo Fan had previously tortured them for tens of thousands of years. It could be said that Luo Fan spared no effort in order to enhance their cultivation methods and stimulate their potential as much as possible. In this way, their cultivation techniques had indeed grown, and their strength had also increased. Even their cultivation realms improved tremendously. However, their will to fight, their willpower, and their will to resist had all been worn down. In other words, Luo Fan's torture of them was equivalent to pulling up seedlings to help them grow. On the surface, it seemed like they had already grown to an extremely high level. But in actuality, their minds were still in a state where they had yet to grow. Compared to their strength and realms, they were still far too lacking. Because of this, the disaster that was originally only 1 point became 10 points in their minds, and the disaster that was originally 10 points became 100 points. Under such terrifying pressure, it was normal for their minds to collapse and become hysterical. After understanding this reason, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. With a slight thought, his power spread out from the palace that was between reality and illusion. Through the abstract nature of the cultivation method, it was transmitted to all living beings in the world. As an abstract cultivation system, it was naturally impossible for it to be attached to the cultivation system and not be observed or sensed by ordinary living beings, or even any living beings. In actuality, after obtaining this abstract nature, Luo Fan actually had the ability to control the carrier of the cultivation method to a certain extent. This wasn't strange. After obtaining this abstract nature of the cultivation method, it was as if it had its own activity. For example, it could choose certain living beings to cultivate the cultivation method, choose certain living beings to cultivate the cultivation method, choose certain living beings to see the cultivation method, reject certain living beings, and so on. Wasn't all this just a certain degree of control over the carrier of the cultivation method? And this kind of control ability was constantly strengthened and improved. When it reached the level of Luo Fan's current fragment, it would naturally be inconceivably improved, to the point where it could control the living beings that were the carrier of the cultivation method. In this instant, the living beings who had already lost all hope and became hysterical felt their bodies become sluggish. The power, might, and magical abilities that were originally flowing at their will were completely out of their control at this moment. At this moment, no matter how much they urged, they could no longer display any abilities that surpassed ordinary people. They could only watch helplessly as their opponents counterattacked, and they collapsed and were destroyed one by one. In the end, only the cultivation method turned into scrolls and floated where they originally were. At this stage, Luo Fan's goal in this perfect world was to collect all the fragments of the abstract nature of the cultivation method that he had turned into. The hysterical living beings who had the cultivation method naturally had a part of his fragment. Therefore, how could he allow those cultivation methods to disappear in the midst of their deaths? It was precisely because of this that although the living beings had died, their cultivation methods were left behind. Of course, this was also because these living beings had died under his control, which was why he was so obvious about it. If it was a normal battle between ordinary living beings, they would still have a chance to reincarnate. Because living beings still had the chance to be reincarnated, those cultivation methods were still hidden in the living beings' memories. After they reincarnated, they would still be stimulated at a certain moment and reappear in the world. Therefore, before this, he did not let these cultivation methods turn into carriers and leave them behind. This was why, before this, other than the most outstanding living beings in the world, there had never been such a thing like this, where after a living being died, their cultivation methods would turn into scrolls and be left behind. This novel change made the many living beings who had dealt with the hysterical living beings somewhat confused. They did not know why this had happened. However, this confusion was soon suppressed by the impending arrival of the first great tribulation of the world. No matter what the reason was, as long as these living beings who had caused trouble disappeared, it would be a good thing for them to face the first great tribulation of the world. As for what happened to these scrolls, that was a matter for the future. Immediately, the living beings began to put away the scrolls and contacted the living beings they knew, seeking to unite everyone to resist the first great tribulation of the world. Chapter 23:19. This huge alliance encompassed most of the living beings in the world. In other words, it was already the majority of the cultivators in the world. Through Luo Fan's teachings, the existence of cultivation methods had long been deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts and became the standard for all living beings to improve. Under such circumstances, these living beings could no longer be called mere living beings. They had already surpassed the level of basic living beings and established their own pursuit. They could now be called cultivators. The combined power of this massive alliance was secondary. The most important thing was that the establishment of this alliance had suppressed the conflicts between the majority of cultivators. It was as if there was an even greater conflict suppressing them, causing all the irreconcilable hatred and conflicts between them to seem insignificant. The conflicts between many living beings naturally became extremely rare due to this change. It made the entire world seem incomparably peaceful. However, what was unexpected yet reasonable was that their choice did not cause the ominous aura that filled the world, which represented the arrival of the great tribulation of the world, to not dissipate. Instead, it continued to increase bit by bit as time passed. However, the speed at which it increased was much slower than before. Many cultivators had already expected this situation. After all, if the great tribulation of the world could be avoided so easily, it would not be called a great tribulation of the world. However, even though they had expected it, they still felt somewhat disappointed when they actually saw it. Luo Fan directly informed everyone about the situation of the great tribulation of the world. This was enough for them to confirm Luo Fan's thoughts. However, under the terrifying pressure of the great tribulation of the world, not all cultivators could maintain their rationality. Not all cultivators could persevere and strive to become stronger. After all, there were cultivators who placed their hopes on Luo Fan. Therefore, after the alliance was established, a large number of cultivators from all directions gathered at the hall that Luo Fan had opened up. They made all sorts of efforts to contact Luo Fan and ask Luo Fan to help them survive this great tribulation of the world. Moreover, as time passed, the number of such cultivators continued to increase. In the short span of 100 years, billions of living beings had gathered here, and the process of pleading with Luo Fan had developed into a complete and strict system. It could almost be called a religion, however. No matter how pious their request was, no matter how solemn they made this request ceremony, Luo Fan did not pay any attention to them. He just quietly hid in the palace that seemed to be real and illusory, watching the changes that happened in the world, and watching the cultivators solemnly asking him to help them. The reason for this was naturally not because he had a heart of stone, but because he was extremely clearly aware that he was utterly unable to interfere. In fact, at the very beginning, before the alliance was established, Luo Fan had wanted to leave this palace to personally face the first great tribulation of the world. However, just as he was about to leave the palace, he felt an indescribable palpitation in his heart. This palpitation was so intense that he even felt that he would die in the next instant, and his soul would scatter. Faced with such a strong premonition of danger, it was easy to imagine what Luo Fan would choose. The higher one's cultivation was, the more one would believe in their premonitions and self-awareness. This was especially true for people at Luo Fan's level. The appearance of this palpitation made him clearly understand that if he had left the palace at that time and entered the perfect world, the great calamity of the perfect world would have been triggered immediately. All the power and terror would have poured down on him. It was precisely because of this that he was indifferent to the pious pleas of all the living beings. The behavior of these cultivators gradually made the other cultivators unhappy. After all, they were currently working so hard to prepare for the great tribulation of the world, but these cultivators completely ignored them and wholeheartedly begged a powerhouse who had long said that he would not help. What was the difference between this and slacking off? Therefore, after more than 100 years, the Grand Alliance made a move. Orders were passed and cultivators were dispatched to various places in the world to set up formations and refine abilities. Because Luo Fan did not give these living beings any response, these living beings who were sincerely begging were naturally more and more disappointed. Although some of them were stubborn, most of them still obeyed the orders of the Grand Alliance, and went to various places in the world to prepare for the great tribulation of the world that was about to happen. In the end, after another 100 years, there were only a few tens of thousands of cultivators left. Although the Grand Alliance was extremely unhappy with these stubborn cultivators, they did not treat them as enemies. Therefore, they could only helplessly let them stay and carry out their futile actions. Perhaps tens of thousands of cultivators were not considered weak, but compared to the entire Grand Alliance, they were definitely insignificant. Under such circumstances, the Grand Alliance was clearly unwilling to delay the work of the entire Grand Alliance for the sake of these cultivators. Whether they sent people to persuade them or to send people to suppress them, the gains clearly did not make up for the losses. It could be said that by this time, the Grand Alliance had completely given up on these cultivators. In fact, one could even predict that when the Great Tribulation of the world descended in the future, their existences would probably be ignored by the Grand Alliance. Time passed by minute. Unknowingly, tens of thousands of years had passed. During these tens of thousands of years, due to the efforts of the entire Grand Alliance, the situation in this world had undergone earth-shattering changes. Countless formations, divine abilities, artifacts, and treasures appeared everywhere in the world, vaguely enveloping the entire world from top to bottom. It could be said that the world was armed to the teeth. Even Luo Fan could not help but sigh in admiration when he saw this efficiency. After all, even though this period of time seemed to be tens of thousands of years and seemed to be rather long, it wasn't even enough for an itinerant celestial to fly from one end of the world to the other in such a vast and perfect world. Under such circumstances, the entire Grand Alliance had been able to arm such a vast world to this extent in such a short amount of time. The efficiency was self-evident. However, even with such preparations, it seemed to be insufficient for the first great tribulation of the world that was about to descend. With a thought, Luo Fan decided to give some pointers to the living beings in this world. Immediately, a will left the hall and poured into the countless cultivation methods that existed in the world through some kind of extremely abstract channel. As the thought descended, all the cultivation techniques that existed in this world underwent an extremely subtle change at the same time. Descriptions of the baleful auras and the Great Tribulation appeared on the countless cultivation technique. The change was not subtle at all. Very soon it was discovered by the owners of the cultivation technique. At that moment, all the cultivators felt an indescribable sense of hope emerge from the bottom of their hearts. The origin of the techniques hasn't given up on us. Among the various hopes, this thought occupied the highest position and became the source of joy in the depths of the cultivators' hearts. Previously, although they had been self-reliant and used their potential to help set up defenses in this world by constructing various protective techniques and formations, they were still somewhat disappointed. However, they were still a little disappointed in the bottom of their hearts. After all, the strength that Luo Fan had displayed when he was naked was simply too powerful. It was so powerful that they could not even see the end of it. However, such a powerhouse was actually unwilling to help them at all. In fact, it was as if he did not exist at all. How could they not be disappointed by such a choice? How could they not suspect that Luo Fan had given up on them and this world? It was only at this moment that the changes in their cultivation techniques made them understand that Luo Fan had not given up on them. The fact that Luo Fan did not help them directly and did not participate in their defense of this world meant that he probably had some difficulties that they could not understand. This feeling was like a child who had been thrown out of their home and suddenly discovered that their parents were still secretly watching over them and protecting them. It was as if they had some unspeakable difficulties that they had been thrown out of their home. The feeling of going from hell to heaven was enough for all the cultivators to unleash their extremely powerful potential. Of course, this did not include the cultivators who stubbornly insisted on asking Luo Fan to personally take action in this hall. For those cultivators, since Luo Fan could do this, he naturally could do even more. He should be able to directly resolve this great tribulation this time. Therefore, when they discovered that their cultivation techniques had changed, they became even more fervent in their pleas for Luo Fan to take action, as expected. Luo Fan could not help but feel helpless when he saw the increasingly fervent pleas from the living beings in the hall. He knew that these cultivators would be like this, which was why he did not ask them to stop. He clearly knew that once he opened his mouth, What awaited him would be an endless stream of begging and crying. No matter what he said as he sighed, he could only conveniently isolate their voices and images, completely ignoring them. Time passed minute by minute. Another tens of thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. The great tribulation that had been brewing for tens of thousands of years finally completed its brewing process and began to descend. The boundless baleful aura surged in the world. At the first instant it changed the laws of the world, causing the huge formation that the Grand Alliance had spent tens of thousands of years to build, which connected the entire world, to tremble before collapsing with a bang. Boundless terrifying shock waves were released from the formation, tearing countless cracks in the ground and forming countless deep canyons. As for the living beings within, it was unknown how many trillions of them died. Fortunately, although the cultivators of the Alliance did not expect the formation to be torn apart so easily by the baleful aura, they were not weaklings after all. In the face of such a drastic change in the world, they were still able to react in the end, and were not affected by the collapse of the formation. Apart from a few unlucky people who were injured due to various reasons, there were almost no casualties. The Great Tribulation has descended. Luo Fan sighed when he saw this. He could not be more familiar with the Great Tribulation of the world. Whether it was the primordial world, the perfect world that he had created, or the perfect world that was connected to Earth, he had seen many of them. He could not be more familiar with the changes in the ominous aura before him. It was the kind of change that could only happen in a great tribulation that could overturn the world if it could not be stopped. What a powerful great tribulation! Quickly resist it! The cultivators of the Great Alliance roared. In the blink of an eye, all the spells, magic treasures in the world began to release light and attack the boundless killing intent that was suppressing the entire world. These attacks contained the techniques that Luo Fan had imparted to the cultivation methods of the cultivators to counter the Great Tribulation. Although the attacks were not enough to eliminate the ominous aura, they were quite effective in dispersing the ominous aura. Due to the attacks, the world finally became clear, showing a sky that had not been shrouded in ominous aura for hundreds of thousands of years. This change made the cultivators of the Great Alliance heave sighs of relief. After all, although this did not mean that they had passed the Great Tribulation, at least it meant that their preparations were useful for the Great Tribulation. However, just as they were secretly heaving a sigh of relief, a new change occurred. At the location where Luo Fan's hall used to be, a roar suddenly rang out. Unparalleled power shot into the sky. One by one, figures erupted with terrifying power and began to charge at the League of Cultivators. They attacked all the cultivators and living beings in their way indiscriminately. What's going on? The cultivators of the Great Alliance were dumbfounded. This was not what they had expected. It should be noted that the cultivators who had suddenly charged at them were none other than the cultivators who had sincerely asked Luo Fan to help them resist the Great Tribulation of the world. Chapter 23:20. They had never thought that these cultivators, who had wholeheartedly abandoned their dignity for the sake of the world, would suddenly become their enemies. They even thought that even if the other cultivators in the Great Alliance were affected by the tribulation and turned their backs on the world to become the carriers of the tribulation, they would not fall into such a situation. However, they did not expect that these cultivators would be the first to be affected by the tribulation and become their enemies. They could not react in time. In the first wave of attacks, they had already suffered great losses. Most of their defensive abilities around the cultivators had been destroyed. What criteria does the tribulation use to determine the assimilation of the cultivators? At this moment, the leader of the Great Alliance, a sage-to-be expert, was both shocked and furious. This sudden blow directly overturned the situation that seemed to be quite good for them, causing their ability to resist the great tribulation of the heavens and earth to suddenly drop a little. This decrease would continue to increase and magnify under the chain reaction. Perhaps the entire situation would collapse in the end. How could he stay calm? Under such agitated emotions, he began to mobilize the power of the Great Alliance, using a large part of it to fight against these cultivators who had been assimilated by the great tribulation of heaven and earth. He wanted to stop them from causing more damage to this side of the world. Although these cultivators were also companions, they were mentally prepared to fight against the cultivators who had been assimilated by the tribulation because they had learned about the possible manifestations of the tribulation from Luo Fan. Although the identities of these cultivators were different from what they had imagined, they did not show any mercy in the battle. In the battle, they used their most powerful methods to kill their enemies as fast as possible. Unfortunately, their enemies had already been strengthened by the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Compared to before, they were several times stronger. With this kind of strength, coupled with the fact that the entire world was enveloped by the boundless ominous aura during the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, they were able to provide support and assistance at all times. Even if the cultivators that had been assimilated by the great tribulation of the heavens and earth were few in number, they weren't any weaker than the cultivators of the Great Alliance. For a moment, the situation was in a stalemate. Seeing this, Luo Fan, who was hidden between reality and illusion, felt a headache. He did not expect that the cultivators of the Great Alliance would still perform so poorly even though he had helped them so much. It should be noted that when he had helped the untainted world survive the first tribulation, his strength was much weaker than that of these living beings. However, even under such circumstances, he had allowed the primordial world to survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth without any mishaps, allowing the primordial world to obtain great benefits. These creatures had received so much help from Luo Fan before, and had even clearly analyzed the various possibilities of the great calamity of the world, yet they still performed so poorly. This kind of stumbling appearance made one suspect that the resistance of the world would completely collapse in the next instant, causing the entire world to be completely destroyed in this great calamity of the world. However, even though he wanted to help them, he found that he could not even extend his strength. This was because it seemed that ever since he extended his strength, killing intent had started to gather around his hall. At this moment, the density of the killing intent was thousands of times denser than the killing intent in the world outside. If it wasn't for the fact that the killing intent was extremely mysterious and profound, no matter how dense it would not turn into a solid state. Otherwise, his hall would have probably been completely fixed by the solid formed by the killing intent. However, even if the ominous aura did not solidify, the ominous aura around the palace was already so dense that it completely covered the entire palace. Even from the outside, one could only see the incomparably dense ominous aura. It was impossible to see the palace hidden inside. In this situation, one could imagine that if Luo Fan extended his power, the killing intent would definitely instantly go berserk and frantically pour into the hall along with his power. At that time, it would be equivalent to him completely enduring the tribulation of the world. Although this would greatly reduce the power of the great tribulation of the world that the perfect world had to endure, it could be considered as helping the world from a different perspective. However, he did not have the noble sentiment of sacrificing himself for others. It should be known that the world could not survive the tribulation. As long as his fragment still existed, there would naturally be a way for him to escape and continue living. In the end, it would gather with the other fragments and reform his original body. However, if this fragment perished, then what benefits would he gain even if the world was in perfect condition? It's over, it's all over. Everything in this world is naturally meaningless to him now. With this understanding, was there a need to say what he should do? Therefore, even though he was rather dissatisfied with the performance of the Great Alliance's cultivators, he did not have any thoughts of extending his power to help them. He just quietly watched the development of the situation in this part of the world under the cover of the baleful aura. This time's tribulation was not the strongest among all the tribulation that Luo Fan had seen in the past, but it was not considered weak either. At most, it was of a medium level. The time that the great tribulation of the heavens and earth had lasted was not too short either. As the Great Alliance struggled, the tribulation continued to pass. Before they knew it, 3,000 years had passed. 3,000 years was naturally nothing to Luofan. Even compared to most cultivators in the Great Alliance, it was definitely not a long time. If it was in the past and during peaceful times, they would not feel anything even if they experienced 10 or 103,000 years. However, at this time, during this tribulation, 3,000 years seemed as long as 3 trillion years to them. The torment that existed at every moment and the terror of struggling between life and death almost every second made them feel that a day was like a year. In these 3,000 years, the changes in this great tribulation were innumerable. After they passed through one wave, another wave would be born, and just like that, it was endless, never-ending. In the beginning, the assimilation of cultivators to fight against the Great Alliance was like a child's play compared to the subsequent terrifying tribulations. In the beginning, the cultivators of the Great Alliance had only lost a few million cultivators to deal with the assimilated cultivators, preventing them from destroying the entire world and the Great Alliance. However, as time passed, the tribulations developed, and after 3,000 years, there were tens of thousands of waves of tribulations. Every time they passed a tribulation, they had to pay the price of hundreds of millions of cultivators to be able to withstand it. If it were not for the large number of cultivators in this world and the endless supply of cultivators over the years, the consumption of the tribulations might have been enough to wipe out all the cultivators in this world. However, such a tragic tribulation was not completely without benefits for the cultivators in this world. At the very least, under this incomparably difficult trial, all the cultivators in this world had obtained astonishing growth. The most powerful one, the Alliance Master of the Great Alliance, had already reached the peak of the Sage-to-be realm. It seemed that he only needed some comprehension and some opportunities to cross the peak of the Sage-to-be realm and step into the false Sage realm, to be able to achieve such shocking growth in just 3,000 years. It was enough to show how much the Alliance Master had benefited from this tribulation. After all, from the initial stage of the Sage-to-be to the peak of the Sage-to-be realm, he had crossed 5 stages. Normally, it would take millions or even tens of millions of years to cross one of these stages. Normally, a short 3,000 years wasn't enough to stabilize a single breakthrough. From this aspect, it could be said that the Alliance Master's cheat had already reached the limit. However, it was obvious that he was not the only one who had achieved this result. Almost every cultivator seemed to have turned on a cheat during the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Their strength rose at an unimaginable rate. In just 3,000 years, the strength of the entire world had risen by 3 or 4 levels. Back then, even the cultivators who had just become individual immortals were already considered the most powerful force in the Great Alliance. They could even control some key forces to deal with this great tribulation. However, now, only those who had reached the primordial unity pure sun realm were qualified to be pushed to the front line and face the attack of this great tribulation. This change even distorted the cultivators' concept of cultivation. They thought that cultivation was so simple and that the improvement of cultivation realms could be achieved by a strange explosion. Only Luofan, who had witnessed all this, knew the reason why they could achieve such a huge improvement. In fact, the reason why they could improve so crazily was that this world needed them to improve. In other words, the will of this world needed them to improve. After all, they were helping this world to resist this great tribulation. It could be said that they were protecting this world. Based on the current situation of this world, they were already the most powerful and the last force that could help this world. Under such circumstances, the world could only place its hopes on them. It was equivalent to them receiving the blessing of the world, and the improvement of their cultivation realms was naturally successful. With thousands of years, they had passed through realms that ordinary cultivators would need hundreds of millions of years to reach. After learning about this, compared to the time when he was quite worried about the performance of these cultivators and had inexplicable doubts about whether the world could survive the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, the current Luo fan no longer had any doubts about the world surviving the great tribulation of the heavens. Even though the cultivators seemed to be struggling to survive any wave of attacks, it didn't change his confidence in the world's ability to survive the tribulation. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he already knew that it was not these living beings who were facing this great tribulation, but this world. I didn't expect that I would actually make such a mistake, thinking too highly of myself. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind at some point, causing an inexplicable wry smile to appear on his face. At this moment, he recalled all the world tribulations he had experienced in the past. He could only sigh at how he had overlooked such an obvious thing back then. Just now, he had been secretly proud of himself for helping those worlds survive the world tribulations again and again, so, it has always been the world itself that is facing the great tribulation. Living beings and cultivators are just carriers of the power of the world. As long as the world is strong enough, it will naturally be able to survive the great tribulation. It has nothing to do with the living beings and cultivators. As he thought about this, his expression became even more bitter. If it was not for his perfect temperament and firm will, he would have blushed when he recalled the complacency he had felt before. At this moment, he recalled the process of him helping the world survive the great tribulation again and again. He suddenly discovered more and more details that he had overlooked, or rather doubts that he had overlooked. Those details, those doubtful points, seemed so insignificant when he didn't pay attention to them. But now that he had seen through the truth and recalled it, he realized that those were clearly the various means left behind by the world he was in back then. Back then, he had thought that he had played a great role in helping those worlds survive the Great Tribulation. Without him, the world would have been ravaged by the Great Tribulation. But now that he recalled those details, those doubtful points, he realized that even if he didn't have himself back then, without any effort, without any means, the world could still find another him. Find another existence to play a similar role. Help the world survive the Great Tribulation. It could be said that to those worlds, his role was actually equivalent to a carrier of the power of the world. In fact, it could even be said that he was just a different kind of puppet. It was just like the many cultivators in the Alliance in this world at this moment. Without these cultivators, the world would definitely be able to give birth to more living beings. Some cultivators even directly did not rely on living beings or cultivators. Instead, they directly used other existences to bear their power to resist the Great Tribulation. Chapter 23-21. Judging from how the cultivators were able to comprehend some profound truths of cultivation just by falling, the power of this perfect world was clearly still extremely powerful. It clearly still had strength to spare for the great calamity of this world. In this way, no matter what happened in the middle, the world would definitely be able to survive the great calamity of this world in the end. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly as he looked at the obviously impassioned expressions of the many cultivators in this world. He did not look down on these cultivators much. It was not only because he had a similar performance back then. It was also because their perception, from a certain point of view, was not wrong. Perhaps, from a macroscopic point of view, the cultivators themselves were actually dispensable. Even without them, the world could still find other existences to help it survive the great calamity of this world. However, when it came to individuals and living beings, the situation was completely different. As individuals, they were indeed shouldering the power of a certain part of the world's counterattack, helping the world resist the great calamity that wanted to destroy the entire world. At the very least, they were currently irreplaceable existences. Moreover, besides that, they had become puppets and chess pieces that were controlled by the heavens and the earth during the calamity of the heavens and the earth. However, they had also obtained great benefits in the process. After all, the world needed them to help it resist the great calamity of this world, so it naturally had to give its power to the many living beings. The power given might be insignificant to the world, but to the many living beings, it was the motivation for their transformation and ascension. Once they could survive the great calamity of this world, they would definitely be completely different from before the great calamity of this world. From this aspect, they had the right to be so impassioned. Luo Fan quietly watched the world and the great calamity of this world fight against each other. Time passed second by second during this process. The development of the situation was just as he had expected. The world gradually suppressed the great calamity of this world and gradually gained the upper hand in the fight against the great calamity of this world. The murderous aura that had gone through billions of changes in the void gradually dissipated as the world retaliated. Finally, after more than 10,000 years, all the baleful aura completely dissipated. Endless golden light descended from the sky and instantly enveloped the entire world. It began to seep into the deepest parts of the world, continuously repairing the laws that had collapsed and been destroyed in the great calamity of the world, as well as the laws that had been affected by the unseen world. As for the outer terrain, the vitality that had dissipated during the great calamity was constantly being replenished by the golden light. The vital chi of the entire world increased at an unimaginable speed. The stability of time and the stability of space were all changing to a higher level. The land continued to expand and the sky continued to rise. Even the boundless starry sky seemed to have become increasingly profound, and the number of stars seemed to have increased compared to the changes in the world itself. The cultivators who had put in a lot of effort for the world to survive the great calamity of this world received the special care of the golden light. Their cultivation that had increased by leaps and bounds began to rapidly stabilize in an incomprehensible manner. In their hearts, countless mysterious information continuously appeared, continuously merging into their minds, merging into the depths of their memories, turning into the foundation of their cultivation realm, becoming a boost to their strength. Time no longer had any meaning in these changes. After an unknown amount of time, when the golden light gradually dissipated, the many living beings gradually returned to their senses. They all looked at the world that had been turned upside down in a daze. It felt like it was completely different from the world that they had fought to protect. Did we succeed? Murmurs could be heard from the cultivators who were lucky enough to survive the battle. Only after escaping from the great calamity of this world did they return to their normal state of mind. The various horrors of the great calamity of this world had truly stirred up their fear. In other words, it was commonly known as lingering fear. Before the great calamity of this world, there had been tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of cultivators in this world. However, after experiencing the great calamity of this world that had lasted for tens of thousands of years, they could only sense the auras of cultivators in this world now, even though the remaining auras seemed to be many times stronger than before the great calamity of this world. However, the consumption was so great that it was enough to cause any cultivator to tremble. This kind of fear, this kind of trembling, even suppressed all kinds of joy and excitement brought about by their own advancement at this moment. This is the great calamity of this world. At some point, an ancient sigh came from the Alliance Master of the Great Alliance. After all, the Alliance Master had great foresight, but he was already worried about the next great calamity of this world. One had to know that the message that Luo Fan had transmitted to them had clearly stated that the great calamity of the world would only happen once. Just now they had sacrificed 99% of their cultivators to overcome the great calamity of this world, but that was only the first great calamity of this perfect world. What awaited them next was the second, third, fourth, and finally, the ninth great calamity of this world. Moreover, according to what was said, every great calamity of this world would definitely be more terrifying than the first one. After understanding this, it was obvious what they should do. First of all, this great alliance had to be preserved. Moreover, not only did it have to be preserved, but it had to be developed and strengthened as much as possible. Secondly, the power of this world had to be nurtured and strengthened again. They had to make up for everything that had been lost during the great calamity of this world as soon as possible. For example, living beings, or cultivators. Thirdly, it was the source of magic power that was supporting them from behind. One must know that although the source of magic power did not directly take action during the great calamity of this world, just the information that it had given them before the great calamity was already an unimaginable help to them. Now that they thought about it, if the source of magic power did not tell them about the great calamity of this world would have already been destroyed in the great calamity of this world. This was not an exaggeration to scare them. After all, with the information that the source of magic power had given them, they had made so many preparations. Now there were only a few million cultivators left in this world. Without the information and the various preparations, would these few million cultivators still have a chance to survive? If even the cultivators could not survive, then the great tribulation of the heavens and earth could only end in failure. Thinking of this, before the Alliance Master of the Great Alliance could catch his breath, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. Relying on his strength that was close to surpassing the pseudo-saint realm, he crossed the void and arrived at where Luo Fan's hall was. He bowed respectfully and said, "We have already passed the great tribulation of the world and have come to report to Teacher." The leader of the Great Alliance had already accepted Luo Fan wholeheartedly. He directly used Luo Fan's name to establish a relationship with him and addressed Luo Fan as his teacher. At this time, the other cultivators also reacted one after another. One by one, they began to rush over from all directions. When they arrived behind the Alliance Master, they also paid their respects and asked Luo Fan to grant them an audience. At this moment, the hall that was originally enveloped by boundless ominous aura had regained its clarity. The endless ominous aura that had accumulated in the surroundings had also disappeared along with the disappearance of the great calamity of this world. In other words, at this moment Luo Fan, who was originally restricted in this hall and could not leave, had regained his freedom and could once again travel between this place and the outside world. However, even so, at this moment, Luo Fan did not have any intention of leaving this place to meet those cultivators. Listening to the pleas of the many cultivators, he only said indifferently, "It's not the right time yet, don't get entangled." As he spoke, he ignored the extremely disappointed expressions of the leader and the many cultivators and did not say anything else. Those cultivators pleaded outside for a few days, but they did not get Luo Fan to relent. In the end, they could only sigh and leave this place resentfully. They returned to their own territories and cultivated. Seeing that they had left, Luo Fan withdrew his gaze and began to ponder again. The reason why he did not meet with those living beings at this time was very simple. It was because those living beings had not completely digested the benefits that they had obtained from the great calamity of this world. Their cultivation methods still had not reached the peak that they could reach. In this kind of situation, he would not obtain any benefits at all even if he met them. Furthermore, he did not have any intention of using this reputation to control this world, so he naturally could not be bothered to meet with them. At this moment, he was thinking about a way for his fragment to transcend this world. Right now, he was restricted to this world. Judging from the various situations before, once he did something that transcended the restrictions of this world would definitely directly attack him and exert some kind of attack on him. As a result, unless he could directly resist the attack of this world, it would be impossible for him to transcend this world and leave this world. Under these circumstances, he originally had two methods. The first was to work hard to improve himself until his strength increased to the point where he could resist the strongest attack of this world. The second was to destroy this part of the world, causing it to become dilapidated so that it could reduce the power of the world. This way, the power of the world wouldn't be able to break through one's defenses. Obviously, there were problems with both of these methods. There was no need to say much about the first one. If Luo Fan wanted to fight against the entire perfect world with the body of a living being, then it would be quite difficult even if he was in a complete state. Not to mention that he was only a small fragment that was 1 out of a trillion. If he wanted to do this, he would need to improve a lot. Even if he thought about it now, he would feel a little despair. As for the second method, although it was not as hopeless as the first, it did not have much hope either. To allow the world to be destroyed to the extent that one could bear without destroying the world, and to prevent oneself from being destroyed along with the world, this was obviously an extremely meticulous and complicated process. Just the control of the degree of control was enough to give Luo Fan a huge headache. Not to mention the fact that he was constantly under the vigilance of the world. If he left his hiding place at an inappropriate time, such as during a great calamity of the world, what awaited him would be the joint attack of the world and the forces that were attacking the world. This was even more dangerous and terrifying than being directly suppressed by the world. It could be said that these two methods were clearly not what he could do at the moment. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan felt a headache at this moment, which led to his current performance. While Luo Fan was thinking, the entire world fell into a state of tranquility again. In just a few short years, the devastation caused by the great calamity had disappeared without a trace. The terrifying calamity that affected the entire world had almost become an ancient legend to the newly born living beings. It could be said that in just a few short years, the entire world seemed to have gone through a process of development that would have taken tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of thousands of years. The situation of the entire world had undergone a complete change compared to how it was before. The alliance that played an important role in the great calamity seemed to have not existed in the past few years. It did not interfere with the development of the world at all and allowed the world to develop freely. It also allowed the newly born living beings to occupy the newly born lands and seize the newly born resources. To the newly born living beings, the world was like a brand new world that was completely open for them to develop. It seemed so rich and so free. To them, they felt like they were the first living beings to be born in this world, enjoying all the benefits that only the first living beings could have. The reason for this was actually very simple. First of all, the number of cultivators that survived the great calamity was only a few million. Compared to the world that was more than 10 times wider before the calamity, it was definitely insignificant. If they were spread out, they might not even be able to sense the aura of a single cultivator within 100 trillion kilometers. Chapter 23-22. As time ticked by, the number of newly born living beings in this world increased bit by bit. As the number of living beings increased, the interactions between the living beings naturally increased. Contradictions began to appear gradually. It was just like when the first batch of living beings were born in this world. As a result, fights gradually arose. More and more fights broke out among the many living beings in this world, as well as in the places where resources were concentrated. For these living beings who thought they were the first living beings in this world, the entire world belonged to them. As long as they could defeat other living beings, everything would belong to them. In this way, there was almost no bottom line or limit to their fight. In this kind of battle, an inexplicable order began to gradually emerge. The strong stood out one after another, and the weak were eliminated in the battles. This caused the entire world to gradually form an indescribable order. It could be expected that if things continued to develop in this way, the world would gradually form an orderly civilization. In the end, it would either be passed down for a long time or would break out again and again in a cycle of endless wars. However, the situation was clearly not like this. They thought they were the first living beings in this world, but in fact, they were just a new batch of living beings born after the great calamity. They thought they were the masters of this world, But in fact, they were just guests who stayed in when the masters were not at home. After tens of thousands of years, they gradually perfected the order and gradually built settlements with the strong as the core. Finally, the experts who survived the Great Calamity completed the process of digesting the gains they had obtained from the calamity and finally left their original places to show their existence to this world. These living beings who were born after the calamity had established the embryonic form of a civilization in just a few tens of thousands of years, and their development did not seem like they had only been born for tens of thousands of years. It seemed like they had been born for tens of millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years. However, after all, they had only been born for tens of thousands of years. The highest level of their strength was only at the primordial unity pure yang level. This kind of strength was obviously at the lowest level among those who had survived the great calamity of the world. After they had finished digesting the gains they had obtained from the calamity, it could be said that almost any of the survivors could suppress the world and place the entire world under their shadow. The first survivor to leave his territory wasn't the weakest amongst the survivors. Instead, he was a powerful existence that had reached the innate grand Luo realm. Just the aura of such beings was enough to intimidate all the newly born living beings. Therefore, these survivors had only been out for a few days, but they had already easily destroyed the embryonic form of the civilization that had been established in this world. This made all the living beings suddenly realize that they were not the masters of this world and the strongest beings in this world like they thought they were. They were just weaklings. After understanding this, the various orders that were originally built on this basis naturally collapsed. Of course, even if this order collapsed, it did not mean that the survivors had replaced this order and controlled the newly born living beings in this world. This was because during this process, more and more survivors had finished digesting the gains they had obtained and left their original places to start moving about in this world again. Most of these survivors were comparable to the survivors who came out first, and some could even easily kill them with a finger. Under such circumstances, unless the survivors who came out first had a screw loose, it was impossible for them to try to control the order of this world. As more and more survivors came out, the true history of this world began to gradually spread, and the newly born living beings began to gradually understand their true position. Although the order of this world had been established, the conflicts that had not completely disappeared had finally completely disappeared. After understanding how insignificant they were, the benefits that they had been clinging to became insignificant, and naturally, there was no reason for them to fight. The original order was broken in this process, and a new one was established without the need for any painful process. This new order was none other than the order of the various alliances that had been established with the survivors of the world's calamity as the core. Under this order, the living beings united to develop this world like never before, plundering all the resources that existed in this world, and doing everything possible to nurture and strengthen all the living beings in this world. This kind of behavior was natural for the survivors. However, for the newly born living beings, this was a kind of behavior that was difficult to understand. In the eyes of the newly born living beings, the behavior of the survivors did not conform to common sense at all. After all, although this world was vast, the resources that they could develop and obtain were limited. For every year that others obtained, they would obtain a little less. In fact, once some things were obtained by others, they would never be able to obtain them again. Under such circumstances, conflicts were naturally unavoidable. With conflicts and disputes, they would naturally succeed when the conditions were right. The development of these newly born living beings before the survivors appeared was the best explanation for this development trend. However, the behavior of the survivors completely violated this normal development trend. Whenever they encountered a conflict, no matter how strong the conflict was, it was actually resolved through negotiation. Even if it was a unique resource, it could still be decided after negotiations. No matter how great the disparity in strength between the two sides was, this fundamental solution would not change. This was simply as if there was an incomparably terrifying power spying on them, only waiting for the opportunity to descend and completely wipe them out. If it was just one or two of them, these newly born living beings might not care too much. At most, they would feel that the relationships between the survivors were good and deep. However, this was the case for almost every alliance, and every survivor was the same. This obviously could not be explained by relationships and friendships. What the hell is going on with you guys? You don't even fight for such a treasure. In a certain alliance, a newly born living being finally could not help but roar at the leader of this small alliance. This small alliance was also formed by a survivor and many newly born living beings. Although it was a small alliance, its strength was actually not considered weak. Among them, besides the leader who was a connate perfected immortal realm cultivator, there were also 4 pure primordial yang realm living beings in the alliance. Among the remaining tens of thousands of people, those who had attained the 3rd stage of the earth immortal realm occupied the majority. Even if such an alliance could not be considered as a large alliance, it could be considered as a higher-up that stood close to the peak among the small alliances. This time, this small alliance was fighting for a certain source of life with another small alliance that was obviously weaker than it. This source of life was located at the border of the ocean that was close to the east of the continent. From this source of life to the west was the vast and boundless barbaric mountain range. Further east was only a few tens of thousands of kilometers, and it was the boundless ocean. In the surroundings of this area there were over a dozen small alliances. Among these small alliances, the strongest one was like this small alliance. As for the weak one, it was merely a survivor who had just barely stepped into the connate perfected immortal realm, and it was leading over 10 newly born living beings that were not even at the 3rd stage of the earth immortal realm. These numerous alliances lived together within the area of this mountain range, and they shared the enormous amount of resources within this mountain range. Amongst all the alliances, the one that was roaring furiously occupied the top of the forces, and it could practically be said to be the one who set the rules within this area of the mountain range. The source of life was an extremely miraculous treasure that had just been found within this mountain range. It was the mouth of a spring, and an extremely peculiar spring water was constantly gushing out from the mouth of the spring. The spring water was refreshing, and a single sip of it would allow an ordinary person to break through the limits of their lifespan and become an itinerant immortal. On the other hand, an expert who had already attained the immortal realm would even be able to obtain a visible improvement in his body and strength with just a single sip. No matter from which angle one looked at it, such a spring was an extremely rare treasure. Normally speaking, for the sake of such a spring, even 2 factions would fight it out with each other's brains. Moreover, there were over a few dozen forces here. It could be said that according to normal development, a battle would have probably erupted a long time ago. It was even to the extent that a large area of the mountain range might have been completely wiped out by the aftermath of the battle. However, what had the Alliance Master done now? He had actually completely withdrawn from the fight for the source of life through a seemingly childish bet. In other words, even though the source of life was still ownerless, it no longer had anything to do with the Alliance and the heavenly Venerate. How could the creatures in the Alliance accept this? Hearing this, the Junior Alliance Master chuckled and said, "The treasure is good, but it's not enough to damage our friendship." The newly born creature was even more enraged. He had already thrown caution to the wind, completely disregarding the difference in strength between him and the young chief. He even grabbed the collar of the young chief and shouted angrily at his face, "Did you hurt our friendship? Cultivation is about fighting. It's about fighting. This world seems vast and boundless, but for us, resources are limited. If we don't fight, how can we cultivate? How can we transcend? You're a dignified Alliance Master, shouldn't you fight for the rights of your subordinates?" How can you give up in such a childish way? What kind of alliance master are you? Hearing this, the junior alliance master's expression did not change. He was still smiling. Only after the newly born creature had finished spitting did he slowly push his hand away. He shook his head and said, "All of you in the end are still too short-sighted." Short-sighted? The newly born creature was even more enraged. It was the alliance master who made a mistake, but now he was blaming them for being short-sighted and not being able to see through his actions? How shameless was that? The junior alliance master looked up at the sky. His eyes seemed to reflect the boundless murderous aura that covered the world during the great trial of heaven and earth. He seemed to hear the world shattering and all kinds of horrifying sounds of his companions dying. The great trial of heaven and earth will happen more than once. In the great trial of heaven and earth, if we don't unite all the forces that can be united, death will come at any time, he murmured. Hearing this, the newly born creature said angrily, "Alliance Master, we don't know if the great trial of heaven and earth will come. Even if it does, we don't know how long it will take. You're going to sacrifice yourself and give up your cultivation for this. Isn't that even more stupid?" "You've finally said the word stupid. I thought you would be able to endure it for a long time." The junior alliance master smiled with interest. Hearing this, the newly born creature was so angry that its lungs almost popped out. Was this the time to be concerned about this? Just as he was about to flare up, the little alliance master replied, "Perhaps it's stupidity. But if you've experienced the great trial of heaven and earth, you'll know that compared to your own cultivation, there are more important things. For that, it's completely worth it to delay your cultivation." The junior alliance master was about to retort. Suddenly, the junior alliance master asked, "Do you know how many of us were there before the great trial of heaven and earth?" Hearing this, the newly born creature was stunned. It wanted to ignore the question, but seeing the junior alliance master's serious expression, it knew that he was asking it seriously. At that moment it could only suppress its displeasure and said, "There should be more than 10 million. Regarding this, you've always kept it a secret. Not much information has been leaked." "More than 10 million? The junior alliance master's expression became extremely complicated. It seemed to be sadness, pain, shock, lingering fear, and an indescribable hatred. After a while, he said, "If you add 100 million behind this number, perhaps it's about the same number as before. More than 1 trillion. Regardless of whether it was the junior alliance master who had been talking to him or the other newly born creatures who were watching from the side, they were all dumbfounded and couldn't believe their ears. "Alliance Master, don't tell me you're talking about one?" one of the creatures asked blankly, its expression full of anticipation. "What do you think?" The junior alliance master replied. Chapter 23:23. Adding 1 after 10 million, it was only 100 million at most. Although this was already a little exaggerated, it was still within the scope of understanding. After all, after the great calamity, there were millions of survivors in this world. Hundreds of millions of living beings had gone through the calamity, and only a few million were left. The survival rate was roughly equivalent to 1%. Although it was still an extremely small probability, in the scope of those living beings' understanding, this possibility clearly existed. However, the junior alliance master was talking about trillions of living beings. There were so many living beings, but only a few million were left after the calamity. In the blink of an eye, the survival rate dropped from the original 1% to a few hundred million. This had obviously directly surpassed their most terrifying guess about the great calamity. How could they remain calm at this time? That great calamity is actually so terrifying? The living beings murmured, their expressions filled with shock. There was even an indescribable fear in the depths of their eyes. At this moment, they suddenly understood why the Junior Alliance Master cared so much about unity with the other alliances. If such a terrifying calamity would appear again, Then if they did not unite with the other alliances, they had no confidence that they could survive it. The Junior Alliance Master sighed when he saw that the crowd no longer had any thoughts of questioning him in their shock. In his heart, he was rather clear that perhaps this kind of unity only had an effect on the soul. In reality, how much effect could such unity have in the face of the great calamity? However, when he thought of the terrifying great calamity, even though he knew that such unity might not have much effect, he was still unwilling to give up. No matter how much effect it had, as long as it was not completely useless, he was willing to spend countless efforts to pursue it. He believed that the other survivors definitely had similar thoughts. If it wasn't for this, the world would not have seemed so peaceful and tranquil. It was just like the fight for the source of life. If it wasn't for the fact that everyone had such restraining thoughts, how could they have escaped so easily? Don't forget, for truly precious things, no one would believe you no matter what you said. In other words, no matter how much he insisted that he would not participate in the fight for the source of life, and how much he insisted that he had no interest in their fight, the other alliances would definitely not believe him. To them, as long as he knew about the existence of the source of life and didn't leave the mountain range, then he would be in danger. In other words, if things developed normally, their small alliance would first be attacked by the other alliances. After they were eliminated, the remaining people would fight for the source of life. But now, things were clearly not developing in this way. This was enough to prove that it wasn't the little alliance master who wanted to unite the others as much as possible. The other alliance masters also had the same idea. Almost everything that happened in this mountain range could happen anywhere in the world. All sorts of conflicts and disputes that were originally enough to cause a monstrous war were resolved in a peaceful way that ordinary cultivators and newly born living beings couldn't understand. It was as if the moral standards of every cultivator had been raised to an unimaginable height. This way of development was extremely beneficial to the accumulation of power in this world. In just a few tens of thousands of years, the situation in this world had changed once again. The number of living beings had increased by tens of thousands of times compared to tens of thousands of years ago. With so many living beings, the level of this world had long surpassed the level before the first great tribulation of the world. Moreover, due to the wonderful environment, the cultivation realm of the living beings in this world had also been greatly improved. For example, the Alliance Master of the Great Alliance had already stepped into the pseudo-saint realm. His strength was so powerful that just his aura alone was enough to suppress the heavens and earth, intimidating all living beings in this world. With such terrifying strength, the Alliance Master of the Great Alliance had unknowingly been pushed to the altar and became a great emperor who ruled over the world and all living beings, even surpassing the reincarnation of the world. As he was pushed to the altar, the Great Alliance that was originally just a scattered organization directly changed into an empire. Its control over the entire world and all the cultivators in this world had unknowingly increased by hundreds of times. Under the rule of this empire, the entire world had become a much tighter entity than before. It was a pity that the peace of this world was indeed beneficial to the improvement of cultivation realm. However, it was not so wonderful for the improvement of the combat strength of living beings. Compared to the great improvement of cultivation realm, the combat skills of the cultivators that had been nurtured for tens of thousands of years were unimaginably inferior. If compared to the living beings before the Great Tribulation, a living being in the same realm back then could defeat 100 living beings of the same realm now. Moreover, this gap continued to widen with the passage of time. It was conceivable that in the future, the gap might even be as huge as the distance between heaven and earth. The reason for this was obviously very simple. Because in this world that was almost absolutely peaceful, there were very few fights. Without a fight, the living beings suffered fewer injuries and had a higher chance of survival. However, at the same time, the living beings could not get any training at all. In fact, Some living beings did not even know that there was such a thing as a fight in this world from birth to death. He might not even have a chance to spar with other people. Under such circumstances, how could their combat strength be trained? And without training, how could they display their strength? The living beings that could climb to the top of this world were obviously not fools. They gradually understood the situation of this world. For a time, a kind of uneasiness began to accumulate in the top. If this goes on, how much combat strength will we have when the next great tribulation comes? Instead of this, it is better to let the world return to its original state of chaos. Chaos will reduce the number of living beings, increase the conflicts among living beings, and even speed up the production of evil aura. However, in the end, there will be more and more powerful cultivators, and our resistance against the Great Tribulation will be strengthened. This kind of thought unknowingly appeared in the minds of some of the top leaders. As time passed, this kind of thought became stronger and stronger. Finally, on a certain day, hundreds of cultivators who had entered the sage-to-be level came to see the great emperor. No one knew what they said. They only knew that after they left, the great emperor went into hiding and did not show up in this world anymore. It was as if he did not exist at all. The sage-to-be who met the great emperor directly divided into several camps and began to gather cultivators. They built their own forces and spread out across the world, seizing all the resources in this world and destroying all the cultivators who stood in their way. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, the blood-red light appeared in this world. For the living beings that did not even know what a battle was, the sudden appearance of the enemy and the sudden strangulation was like a rope around their neck. They were all dumbfounded. In the end, the forces of the sage-to-be easily occupied all kinds of resources. After that, they divided the entire world into regions like they were dividing a cake. They occupied those regions and worked hard to seize all resources, develop themselves, and nurture their own cultivators. From the time they left the great emperor's place to the time they divided the entire world into territories, only 100 years had passed. In just 100 years, the whole world had changed so much that the original cultivators could not recognize it at all. The original peace had disappeared without a trace. It was replaced by a certain tension of confrontation and an indescribable pressure that could break out at any time. It has begun. At this moment, in the place between reality and illusion, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. He had been watching the development of this world from the beginning. From the arrogance and self-confidence of the newly born creatures, to the restraint and peace of the survivors, to the awakening of the higher-level creatures, to the beginning of the peace of this world, to the beginning of resistance. He saw all of this with his own eyes. If it was an ordinary person, he might just watch and would not be able to obtain any useful information. But obviously, Luo Fan was not an ordinary person. He had knowledge that ordinary people could not compare to. In this process, he saw the root of all the changes. He saw the reason for the development of this world after the great calamity. He saw the reason for the gratitude that caused this world to develop in the same way as what he had seen before. At this moment, he suddenly said, "The fact that you can find me proves that your strength has reached the requirements. Come in." Then, the door of the palace suddenly opened. As the door opened, a figure with an incomparably powerful aura walked in respectfully. It was as if the entire world was incomparably small in front of him. It was as if he only needed to make a slight move to shatter the world. This figure was none other than the great emperor. He had disappeared for 100 years, but now he actually appeared in this place that was between reality and illusion. He had come to the front of Luo Fan's palace. The hall was still filled with a boundless starry sky. Luo Fan sat upright in this starry sky like a supreme deity suppressing the heavens and earth. Although there was no aura around him, any living creature that saw his body would naturally be shocked. Just like the great emperor at this moment. At this moment, he felt a great shock in his heart. Even the aura that his body emitted began to shrink. In the blink of an eye, he had turned from a supreme existence that could shake the world and space with a single breath into an ordinary young man. Disciple pays his respects to teacher. The young man bowed to Luo Fan from afar and said. Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, the young man had already crossed space-time and appeared in front of him. There's no need to be so polite. Now you can cultivate well here. You still lack too many areas and your ability to unleash your strength is extremely shallow. You still need to polish it. You don't have to care about the outside world. Hearing this, the great emperor's eyes lit up and he looked excited. He said, Disciple obeys. Luo Fan nodded with a smile. Then, he began to guide the cultivation of the great emperor in front of him. He explained the essence of cultivation in this world, the essence of each realm, and the cultivation of a pseudo-sage to the great emperor bit by bit. Although the great emperor had reached the pseudo-sage realm, he had to figure it out by himself after all. His own cultivation method was not perfect, and his own path of cultivation was still vague. Under such circumstances, the power that he could unleash was countless times weaker than that of a normal faux holiness cultivator. It could be said that even a stage 1 pseudo-sage could easily get rid of thousands of him. If Luo Fan hadn't helped him reconstruct his Tao foundation, reorganize his own cultivation path, and reorganize his own strength, it would have taken him countless years to realize all of this, and even more years to think of a way to make up for all of these deficiencies. However, at this moment, with Luo Fan's guidance, he could obviously bypass these countless years. While guiding the great emperor, Luo Fan observed the great emperor from the inside out. This was actually the fundamental reason why he was so enthusiastic to guide the great emperor. The great emperor was the living being that had gained the most benefits from the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Obviously, he was also the living being that had received the most attention from the will of this world. In this way, he could be said to be the main character of this era of this world. Through him, it was easier to see the will behind this world and see the inclination of this world. Moreover, to Luo Fan, who was currently being targeted by the heavens and the earth and might be erased by the tribulation of the heavens and the earth at any moment, this was obviously the best experimental subject with reference value, and it was sufficient to allow him to bypass countless obstructions and see many things in this world. Otherwise, how could he let the great emperor, who was only a pseudo-sage, discover him? How could he be so proactive in guiding the great emperor's cultivation? The effect of the world was obviously extremely obscure and mysterious. Even if it was Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to discover the traces of its function so easily. Chapter 23-24. Everything about the great emperor seemed so natural. Apart from the slight strangeness in the process of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, there was nothing special about him. As for what Luo Fan was looking for, there was no trace of the effect of the world on him at all. In comparison, it seemed that Luo Fan had more traces of the world on him. Luo Fan was naturally a little disappointed with this result. However, this development was within his expectation, so he was not too surprised. He continued to nurture the great sovereign and tried his best to leave his own mark on the great sovereign's cultivation. Time passed by slowly. Tens of thousands of years had passed unknowingly. After tens of thousands of years of cultivation, the emperor's cultivation realm had truly stabilized at the pseudo-saint level. Compared to when he first stepped into this palace, the emperor's power was more than tens of thousands of times stronger. At this moment, if he crossed the river of time and faced the emperor before he stepped into this palace, he did not even need to do anything. He could easily deal with the emperor with just a thought. This was what he had achieved after he fully unleashed his pseudo-saint cultivation realm. It also meant that there was a huge gap between the cultivation attainments of the countless beings in this world and the true powerhouses. On this day, the emperor said to Luo Fan, "Teacher, disciple feels a sudden impulse these days. I need to leave for a while. Please allow me. Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Perhaps this was a chance to see how the world worked. He smiled and said, "Go ahead." Hearing this, the emperor was overjoyed. He quickly thanked Luo Fan and left the palace respectfully. After leaving the palace, his body swayed and left this place that was between the real and the fake. He returned to the perfect world in the outside world. If it was him from back then, his aura would have surged out and spread to the entire world. He would have suppressed all living beings, all cultivators, and all existences in this world. He would have let all existences know of his arrival in an instant. But now, after Luo Fan's guidance, his control over his own strength, his own divine ability, his own aura, and even everything else had reached the acme of perfection. Under such circumstances, as long as he willed it, no existence would be able to detect his existence, determine his location, or sense any of his aura. At this moment, he had returned to this perfect world after being separated from it for tens of thousands of years. However, there was no aura at all. In fact, even some of the alliances that had settled nearby did not discover any existences coming out from the secluded place where the origin of the technique resided. They really did a good job. With a slight thought, countless pieces of information flowed into the great monarch's mind. He instantly understood what had happened in the tens of thousands of years that he had been away. At that moment, he could not help but reveal an indescribable joy on his face. Back then, when the quasi-saints came to explain to him how dangerous it was for this world to continue as it was, he immediately agreed with them. He also gave them the authority to start an orderly battle in this part of the world at the first possible moment. Later on, when some quasi-saints went to meet him, he disappeared, and the original harmony of this world was completely broken. From the various information that he had obtained, what the quasi-saints had done over the tens of thousands of years had even exceeded his imagination. At this moment, the entire world had been divided into dozens of camps. Compared to what he had arranged in the past, there were a lot more. However, the conflicts between the camps had perfectly carried out his original request. In the midst of the battles, a certain amount of order had been maintained and the bottom line was maintained. And above the bottom line, the characteristics of the battles had been displayed to the extreme. In this way, the entire world was in a dynamic balance between chaos and order. Because of this dynamic balance, all the cultivators and living beings in this world could feel an indescribable pressure shrouding them. The pressure of being overturned and annihilated at any moment caused all living beings to be unable to live a befuddled life like before. All of them had to stimulate all of their potential to the limit, and they had to utilize the strength they possessed to the pinnacle of their abilities. Under such circumstances, the atmosphere of the entire world was completely different from before. The fighting strength of the living beings and cultivators was countless times stronger than before. It had only been a few breaths of time since the Emperor had come out, but there were already thousands of battles going on everywhere in this world. And the situation of these battles had reached a level that could only be achieved when experts that were 3 or 4 levels higher than them fought each other before the Emperor left. Not to mention, the various vigilance, defense, and attack methods that the various camps had set up were completely incomparable to before. It could be predicted that if the great calamity of the world befell at this time, the resistance that the world could trigger would definitely be over 100 times stronger than before. This change made the Emperor feel even more grateful for his decision back then. If he had not made the decision to let those quasi-saints fight, this world would probably still be as lifeless as before, and the fighting strength of the living beings might even be a few times weaker than before. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. The Emperor's heart jolted slightly, and he moved towards the world. The indescribable feeling that made him have no choice but to leave his teacher's position. What he had said to Luo Fan previously was not a lie. He had indeed felt that indescribable tide rush of blood, which was why he had requested to leave the hall and return to this world to search for the source of that tide rush of blood. The feeling was extremely subtle, but it was also very strong. The subtle thing was that no matter what he did, he could not find the source of the feeling, and he could not determine the specific cause of the feeling. However, it was intense because this sudden inspiration was clearly telling him that he must find something. If he still couldn't find it, then what awaited him would be an eternity of regret. At this moment, he turned into a flowing light between this world, and his figure seemed to be in a trance as he headed towards a certain place in this world. The land flashed quickly below him, and the appearance of the land that was completely different from when he had ruled it was constantly imprinted in his senses. The direction he was heading towards was overseas. It was originally under his rule, but he had neglected it. It had never been the focus of his attention. Overseas. The form of the land and sea in this world was actually quite ordinary. In the center, there was a boundless continent that served as the main body of this world, becoming the core of this world. Outside this boundless continent was a boundless ocean that was countless times vaster than the continent. There were islands of various sizes in various parts of the ocean. Some of these islands had environments that were extremely similar to the central mainland, but some of them were vastly different from the central mainland. They looked like a completely different world, a completely different world. Back when the great emperor was ruling, many people had even expressed a certain speculation that there was another continent outside of the central mainland. It was just that it was separated by the boundless sea, and the distance was too great, so it was not discovered by the living beings of the central mainland. The great emperor naturally scoffed at such a thought. After all, he had clearly seen what this world was like back then during the Great Calamity. If there was an even vaster continent outside of the central mainland, why would the source of magic power not be mentioned? Why would it be so difficult for them to pass through the Great Calamity? Why would they have to make such a huge sacrifice? It was also because of his scoff that such a thought did not become popular, and the progress of the overseas exploration also suffered a huge blow because of this. However, when the great emperor left the central mainland and came to the sea, he realized that the overseas exploration that had suffered a huge blow back then had developed greatly in the past tens of thousands of years. Currently, the many islands in the overseas were filled with traces of cultivators' activities. Some of the islands with beautiful environments were even more prosperous than many areas in the central mainland. The number of cultivators and the various traces of cultivation that had been established seemed to be extremely prosperous. At first, he was a little surprised by this situation. However, very soon, he remembered the inexplicable balance between chaos and peace that existed in the central mainland at this moment. To him, this balance was naturally extremely perfect. It was enough to ensure the speed of development of this world, and it could also ensure that the combat power of the living beings in this world would not be too weak, so that they could play their role when the great calamity of the world descended in the future. However, this was only in the eyes of a powerhouse like him who had a macroscopic perspective. To the other living beings in this world, at least to those at the bottom, the situation of this world was already unimaginably bad. They did not have the vision that could see through the ages, so they did not know how healthy this world was for the world itself, and how effective it was for the world to maintain its combat power. All they knew was that the world had fallen into chaos after the Thearcha's disappearance. All they knew was that their peaceful lives were gone forever. All they knew was that if they were to stay in the central mainland, they could die with their souls dispersing and turn into ashes if they were careless. Under such circumstances, cultivators with connections would naturally choose to leave a troublesome place like the central continent. They would head to the unexplored ocean, which might be incomparably wonderful or incomparably terrible, to re-establish their own homes and cultivation grounds. Just like that, over the years, there were naturally more and more cultivators in the overseas. Up until now, it had formed this prosperous scene in the great emperor's eyes. However, Even if these cultivators left the central mainland to avoid the chaos in the central mainland and came to the overseas to establish their own cultivation grounds and homes, obviously they did not completely achieve their goals. In the past, cultivators didn't pay much attention to the islands in the sea. It was a barren land without any signs of human habitation. There were all kinds of dangerous environments and all kinds of ugly creatures on it. For cultivators who came here, they were all completely unfamiliar with it. Under such circumstances, they would naturally have to pay a great price if they wanted to settle down here and establish this place as their home and their Taoist field. They would have to go through arduous battles in order to achieve this. In this way, a battle between them was unavoidable. Now, after tens of thousands of years, although they had made less progress than the cultivators in the central mainland, they had still made great progress and were no longer comparable to the cultivators in the past. From a certain point of view, this had already reached the great emperor's expectations. The great emperor did not pay much attention to the various situations on the overseas islands. He only continued to move forward in the direction that triggered his sudden inspiration. Behind him, one island after another was left behind. As he continued to move forward and went deeper into the ocean, there were fewer and fewer traces of cultivator activity on the islands below. A few days later, after flying hundreds of millions of light-years on the surface of the ocean, the area below had completely turned into a barren land. No matter which island it was, there were no longer any traces of cultivator activity. The traces of living beings within had all turned into all sorts of ugly, sinister, powerful, and even unintelligent living beings. The environment was so harsh that even the living beings in the central mainland might not be able to adapt to it. The deeper he went, the more solemn the great emperor's expression became. He did not expect there to be so many dangerous places and so many sinister living beings in the depths of the ocean at this moment. He suddenly recalled his experience during the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Some living beings were suddenly assimilated by the baleful aura and controlled by the great tribulation, which turned around to attack them and destroy the world. If the great tribulation of heaven and earth breaks out, these living beings will probably become the carriers and help of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. As this thought appeared in his mind, killing intent gradually rose in his heart. Chapter 23-25. The vastness of the island was secondary. After all, although this island was the largest among the sea regions that the emperor had passed by, there were many other islands that were only slightly smaller than this island in terms of size. It was not unusual for such a huge island to exist. What made his killing intent rise was the living creatures on the island. There was no lack of existences that could be compared to a quasi-saint. The terrifying aura that was as deep as an abyss occupied every part of the island. The immense power even distorted time and space, vaguely changing the laws of the place. As a result, the island seemed to be just an island, but it contained mysteries that were thousands of times more complicated than what it looked like on the outside. At the very least, in terms of space, the space inside was thousands of times vaster than what it looked like on the outside. Apart from the immense power, the aura that these terrifying living creatures gave off was absolutely emotionless destruction. This kind of absolute destruction was as if everything in this world and the universe was meaningless to them. It was as if everything had to be destroyed, an existence that had to be destroyed. It was this absolute, emotionless destruction that caused the great emperor to feel a strong desire to kill them. After all, these living creatures were not much of a threat to him at the moment. If he wanted to, he could wipe out the entire island with a single hand, completely annihilating all the living beings on it. However, that was just him. For the other cultivators in this world, even for those quasi-saints who were leading several camps in controlled battles, the existence of these living creatures was enough to wipe them out countless times. In other words, once the tentacles of these living creatures reached the central continent, it would be an apocalyptic crisis for this world, As for whether the living creatures on the island would spread their tentacles to the central continent, it was needless to say. Although the interior of the island had expanded by thousands of times, it was still just an island. Given the instincts of these living creatures, they would feel that the island was not big enough sooner or later and expand their tentacles outwards. Once they expanded outwards, it would only be a matter of time before they discovered a land that was billions of times bigger than this island in the central continent and the endless resources that existed there. It was precisely because the great emperor clearly understood this that he was behaving in such a manner. Since the great monarch had such a thought, he naturally took action without hesitation. He abruptly raised his hand, gathered his pseudo-sage strength, and pressed it down. With a loud bang, the surrounding world began to tremble violently. An earth-shattering tsunami erupted, and the world seemed to have darkened in the blink of an eye. Following this change, the huge island below seemed to have been struck by an invisible palm. From the inside to the outside, from top to bottom, from the highest peak of the island all the way to the depths of the ground, everything turned into dust. After being hit by the surrounding boundless seawater, it had already collapsed, completely turning into sand and stone, melting into the seawater. The entire process was so simple that it was as if this was just an island made of sand and stones. As for the countless creatures on the island, they couldn't resist at all, as if they didn't exist at all. The moment the great emperor made his move, although he did not release any aura, an indescribably mysterious wave had already spread across the entire world. It directly surpassed the speed of everything and swept across the entire world in the blink of an eye, causing the entire world to be immersed in an indescribably oppressive atmosphere. At this moment, all the living creatures with sharp senses could feel the fear that rose from the bottom of their hearts. In particular, the quasi-saints who had become the commanders of the various camps felt the fear that they had abandoned for tens of thousands of years. It was as if they had suddenly returned to their incomparably weak state and returned to the great tribulation of heaven and earth. The uncontrollable fear and the feeling that even if they gave everything they had, they might not be able to withstand the disaster that would befall them in the next moment made their expressions change drastically. Could the great tribulation of heaven and earth have arrived? At this moment, the same thought flashed through the minds of the quasi-saints. They could no longer control their aura freely, and it instantly spread out, directly blasting the place where they were standing into pieces. Many dojos collapsed in the process, causing a huge commotion throughout the central mainland. Their doubts about the great tribulation of heaven and earth soon disappeared without a trace, because, very quickly, everything calmed down, and they could sense that everything had returned to how it was before. It was as if nothing had happened. Illusion. As the same thought appeared in the minds of the quasi-saints, they fell into a state of bewilderment and uncertainty. If an illusion happened to an ordinary person, they would naturally agree with it. However, if it happened to a quasi-saint cultivator, it was a ridiculous possibility. It must be known that a person who could cultivate to the quasi-saint realm was extremely confident in himself. Yet, someone told such a person that the various feelings he had previously were merely an illusion and that something had happened to his mind that caused him to distort the reality? How could they accept that? Under such circumstances, they began to contact each other through various mysterious channels and asked each other about their feelings. With such a connection, their doubts about an illusion were instantly dispelled. If it was only one of them who had such a feeling, it would barely make sense to say that it was an illusion. However, at this moment, dozens of people had the same feeling. It was impossible for dozens of people to have the same illusion, right? After eliminating the possibility of this illusion, they fell into a greater state of doubt. They began to feel paranoid. The great emperor did not care about the impact of his attack. At this moment, he only frowned and looked at the sea that had been completely flattened down below with an indescribable look in his eyes. There was an inexplicable uneasiness in his heart. Why do I feel like I've made some kind of irreparable mistake? Such a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. At this moment the world was clear. The island that had made him feel extremely uncomfortable had been flattened. Everything seemed to have been so smooth, as though nothing had happened and all the problems had been solved. However, where was the source of the uneasiness? Although his way of Tao realm could be considered to be at the peak below Luofan in this world, he was still only a rank 1 pseudo-sage. After all, he was only a rank 1 pseudo-sage. There was still a gap in his ability to grasp some of the deepest changes in the world. No matter how he thought about it, he still did not know where the source of the uneasiness came from. He could only put this matter at the bottom of his heart and continue to move forward in the direction that triggered his sudden inspiration. That's right. Although he had just flattened the island, in reality, it was still not the source that triggered his sudden inspiration. The source that triggered his sudden inspiration was still further ahead in the direction he had been moving. The great emperor could not understand it, but Luofan, who was observing everything in between reality and illusion, could see everything clearly. Even the great monarch could vaguely feel the uneasiness, but he didn't know where it came from. However, he could see it clearly. He knew what it was. Is this the plan of the world's will? Or is it just a pure coincidence? He mumbled to himself. At this moment, his eyes pierced through all obstacles and directly saw the mysterious evolution hidden behind the laws of the world and under the great Tao. Specks of spiritual light with destructive power rushed into the sky from the ruins of the island like a long river. With the help of the mysterious evolution, they scattered into every corner of the world, including the countless islands in the sea and the vast continent in the center of the world. The reincarnation of the world was not the kind that ordinary living beings understood. There was a strange space-time as a transfer point and reincarnated through a certain method. Instead, it was carried out in a more subtle and mysterious way that could not be found. After all the cultivators died, the life imprint left behind by them would enter the cycle of the world. With the circulation of the laws of the world, with the subtle transformation of time and space, and with the changes of the great Tao, it would combine with life in various almost coincidental ways. After experiencing countless indescribable changes, it would transform into a living being and be born in the world. This method of life reincarnation was obviously much more subtle than reincarnation. At the same time, it was also much more difficult to control. Even the current Luofan could only vaguely sense this kind of reincarnation. He could not control it at will. At this moment, the life imprints that originally existed on the islands were completely incorporated into the reincarnation of the world. Moreover, due to the special nature of these living beings, these imprints contained something that the imprints of other living beings did not: absolute destruction. This kind of destruction could not be erased by the laws of the world, time, space, the great Tao, or any other power. Under such circumstances, these living beings that were reborn after the imprints and life imprints naturally also possessed this kind of absolute destruction. In addition, after this kind of life reincarnation, these living beings would obviously obtain something that they did not have when they lived on the islands: wisdom. When a living being with absolute destruction obtained wisdom, it was like a toothless poisonous snake obtaining teeth, a wingless tiger obtaining wings, and a powerless demon obtaining supreme strength that could suppress the world. That level of terror had skyrocketed at least 1,000 times. In other words, the Emperor's previous act of erasing the islands seemed to have easily resolved a certain part of the great calamity that he might encounter in the future. However, in reality, his actions had instead made an enemy that was originally not difficult to deal with 1,000 times more difficult to deal with. From this point of view, the uneasy feeling that the great Emperor had after doing this was completely correct. He had indeed made a mistake that could not be made up for. However, Luofan, who had witnessed all of this, did not care at all. He did not have the thought of stopping the Emperor from making that mistake. Instead, he indifferently watched the situation unfold. He watched as the world fell into an even worse and more dangerous state due to the Emperor's actions. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he had long understood that since ancient times, his true enemy, his true opponent, was not this world's great calamity. It was this world. Of course, this did not mean that the great calamity of this world was on his side. In reality, although the great calamity of this world could be considered the natural enemy of this world, it was also an enemy to Luo Fan. It would be fine if there was no chance, but if there was even the slightest chance, the great trial of heaven and earth would definitely be like the heavens and earth. It would pour all the destruction onto him and completely erase him. Under such circumstances, it was obviously inappropriate for Luo Fan to help this world survive the great calamity of this world or to help the great calamity destroy this world. It could be said that it was an act of aiding the enemy in this way. It was obvious that for Luo Fan, it was obviously the most suitable way for him to watch the world evolve and the battle between the great calamity of this world and this world. As for how he would obtain freedom when the world and the great calamity of this world were both his enemies, how he could transcend this world and reunite with the billions of fragments. Although he had some ideas, they were still unclear. He needed to gain a deeper understanding of the world and the great calamity of this world before he could be sure of a way. Compared to the reincarnation of other lives, the reincarnation of those with the mark of destruction was much faster. In just a few short days, the first batch of those with the mark of destruction had already fused with the upgrade. They were reborn in this perfect world in various ways, ushering in a brand new era, an era that was even more chaotic and dangerous. Whether it was the Emperor or the demi-saints, this was clearly a change that they would not notice. At this moment, the Emperor was still advancing in the direction he was heading, following his whim. Chapter 23-27. Is this the Stage 9 Pseudo-Saint? However, the great Emperor soon cast aside all his doubts and began to carefully experience his cultivation realm that had suddenly increased by hundreds of millions of times. At this moment, he felt that the entire world was imprinted in his senses. With just a slight thought, all the secrets in this world were completely open to him, and he could take them as he pleased. In fact, he could even faintly sense his teacher's hall, which had originally been completely untraceable and hidden somewhere between reality and illusion. This feeling was so wonderful that he couldn't help but indulge in it. Suddenly, he even felt like he was the ruler of this world, and everything in this world could be changed according to his will, feeling his incomparably stable realm that didn't have the slightest bit of flimsiness, comprehending the countless insights that appeared out of nowhere in his memory. The great sovereign's figure gradually became blurry. His aura began to spread in all directions endlessly. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the entire world, causing everything in this world to feel this vast and majestic aura. Along with this feeling, all living beings in the central mainland froze. This time, it wasn't just the quasi-saint experts who sensed this aura. All living beings, regardless of whether they were strong or weak, or whether they had any intelligence, could clearly sense the terrifying aura that enveloped them from an extremely high level and made them feel insignificant. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, was also secretly shocked. His potential has suddenly increased by countless times. How is this possible? Just now, the great Emperor had entered the mist for a long time, but in reality, it was only a few breaths for Luo Fan. But in fact, for Luo Fan, this period of time was only a few breaths. However, in just a few breaths' time, the great Emperor's potential, which was originally clear in his eyes, had deepened by trillions of times. Now, he couldn't even see the end of the great Emperor's potential. He couldn't see how incredible the great Emperor's potential would be once it was truly stimulated. It was as if he had turned from a shallow pond into a boundless sea of stars. Compared to the change in his potential, The change in his cultivation realm from the Tier 1 pseudo-sage to the Tier 9 pseudo-sage peak seemed insignificant. At this moment the entire sky turned dark. It was as if a dark cloud that could cover the heavens and earth had suddenly appeared in the sky, covering the entire sky. Along with this change, the terrifying aura that had spread throughout the world began to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, it had retracted to the boundary of the world and returned to where the great Emperor was. At the same time, the dark clouds that had originally covered the entire world seemed to quickly retract along with the aura. In the end, they gathered in the sky above the boundary of the world, covering an area of 10,000 kilometers. At this moment, the Emperor's illusionary figure became clear once again. He hovered in the air as a strange sense of uncertainty appeared on his face. "What's going on? Why is there a tribulation?" he murmured as he looked up at the dark clouds that were getting thicker and thicker. His heart was filled with shock. One must know that he could almost be said to be the son of the world. He didn't dare to say that everything he did was always successful, but any action he took would be faintly guided by the world. With the blessing of the world, it was much smoother than usual. However, at this moment, he could clearly feel the rejection and malice of the world towards him. The dark clouds that kept accumulating in the sky locked onto him with an extremely strong sense of destruction. It made him feel as if there was a blade on his back. He couldn't help but become agitated and nervous. After cultivating under Luo Fan for so long and receiving so much information in the boundless mist, the great Emperor's knowledge had already far surpassed all the living beings in this world, except for Luo Fan. It was unknown how many lives there were. When he felt the various feelings that the dark clouds brought him, he completely understood that the dark clouds were none other than the tribulation clouds. What he had sensed was exactly what tribulation had given him, and the root of all of this was that the world no longer acknowledged him and no longer cared about him. How can this be? I didn't do anything wrong at all. Moreover, I'm countless times more powerful than I was before, so this is clearly extremely beneficial to the world. Why would the world impose a tribulation on me? Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, causing his expression to change indeterminately. At this moment, there was a strange rumbling sound in the tribulation clouds above the void. It kept surging and echoing in the void. Every time it surged and echoed, it shook the space-time and stirred up the rules and laws. Faintly, it even seemed that the great Tao in the unseen world seemed to have some subtle changes between the surging and the echoing. The space-time within a radius of 10,000 miles had completely become independent at this moment. The inside of the space-time was gradually separated from the outside. As the movement inside grew stronger, the influence on the outside became smaller and smaller. Finally, at a certain moment, when the isolation increased to a certain level, the connection between the inside and the outside within a radius of 10,000 miles was completely cut off. Under this kind of isolation, the area within a radius of 10,000 miles had completely disappeared from this perfect world. At least, for ordinary cultivators in the outside world, even if they raised their perception to the limit, they still wouldn't be able to discover the dark clouds and the existence of the great Emperor in this area. It was just like how they felt about the mist at the end of the world at this moment. Before the great Emperor could figure out what was going on, the dark clouds had become so dense that they seemed to have solidified. Terrifying thunderbolts that seemed to be able to split the heavens and the earth descended from the dark clouds as if they were too heavy. They rapidly pressed down on the great Emperor like a world. Although it was a thunderbolt, it had a completely different characteristic from normal thunderbolts. The great monarch could only put aside all the distracting thoughts in his mind and unleash the strength of the pseudo-sacred stage that he had just obtained to attack the thunderbolt. At this moment, he clearly sensed that he had been completely locked on by the tribulation cloud. No matter where he dodged, it was impossible for him to avoid the thunderbolts. It was precisely because of this that he could only face such an obviously unusual thunderbolt head-on. although he had just obtained the 9th stage pseudo-saint realm, due to some reason that he couldn't understand, his efficiency in using the might, power, ability, and everything else at this level had reached the acme of perfection. At this moment, although his attack seemed to be just forcefully blocking the thunderbolt, during the process, karma, fate, space-time, laws, and all sorts of indescribable abilities were contained in this move of his. As he moved, it collided with the thunderbolt that was like a world. At this moment, the thunderbolt erupted with boundless might that could destroy space and time. It completely destroyed the surrounding space, laws, and even various other things on a deeper level, causing the point of contact between the two to suddenly form a strange vacuum that led straight to the netherworld. The shock wave that was released completely shattered everything within a 10,000-mile radius, causing the originally distorted spacetime to completely collapse and the nomological laws that were originally still connected to each other to be completely destroyed. In this state, the scene in this area had completely changed. The original spacetime had turned into an indescribable fog. It looked like the boundless fog at the end of the world, of course. Compared to the fog at the end of the world, the chaos and assimilation ability of this fog was much weaker. At this moment, the great emperor felt countless strange powers blasting into his body through his means, causing his body to explode without any time. Everything inside his body was completely scattered, and it took a while for it to condense and restore his body. At this moment, another shocking movement came from the sky. Another huge thunderbolt descended from the sky and blasted towards him. Compared to before, the thunderbolt this time was different. There seemed to be strands of strange flames coiling around it. The flames swam wildly in the thunderbolt, emitting an aura that was even more terrifying than the thunderbolt. The great sovereign felt as though his body was about to combust from the inside out. Why does it look like the great tribulation of heaven and earth? At this moment, this thought appeared in the great emperor's mind. Previously, he was the sharp blade for all living beings to resist the great tribulation of heaven and earth. His understanding of the great tribulation of heaven and earth was deeper than that of all living beings. He could tell with a single sense that there were many traces of the great tribulation of heaven and earth in the changes of the thunderbolt. This made him suspect that the great tribulation of heaven and earth had befallen him in another way, if it wasn't for the fact that the tribulation clouds above had some sort of brand that belonged to the world that kept telling him where the tribulation came from. He would have really thought that way. Therefore, there was obviously only one possibility. That was, the world was simulating the great tribulation of heaven and earth. In other words, it was simulating the attack of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Only this possibility could make the tribulation of heaven and earth seem so similar to the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It contained the characteristics of so many great tribulations of heaven and earth. Although this guess was shocking, it didn't stay in the great emperor's mind for too long. This was because he couldn't afford to be distracted by what he had encountered at this moment. Whether it was the attack of the tribulation, the evolution of the world itself, or the great tribulation of heaven and earth that he had encountered before, he would die if he couldn't overcome it. Therefore, he naturally didn't have the energy to investigate the source of these attacks at this moment. He didn't have the time to guess what caused these attacks to appear in such a way. At this moment, he could only muster the strength of a rank 9 pseudo-sage that he had just obtained, condense a supreme ability, and unleash boundless power towards the boundless thunderbolts that were crushing down from above to resist the boundless power contained in the thunderbolts. The flame in the lightning seemed to have the ability to burn everything. After it erupted, it even followed the fragments of spacetime and directly wrapped around the great sovereign's body. It even seeped into the great sovereign's body, wanting to ignite and burn him from the inside out. Fortunately, the great emperor had experience in dealing with the great tribulation of heaven and earth. He had considerable experience in dealing with this kind of terrifying attack that ordinary cultivators who had never encountered before couldn't even find a way to resist. At this moment, the power in his body underwent an extremely mysterious transition. Wisps of flames seeped out of his body and began to mix with the surrounding flames that were eroding his body, trying to invade his body and ignite everything inside and out. He tried his best to interrupt the erosion of the flames and guide them away from his body. Even if it was the correct way to deal with it, it wasn't as simple as it seemed. During this process, the great emperor needed to carry out an extremely complicated arrangement of all the cultivation comprehension that was contained in the depths of his heart. He even needed to ignite some mysteries and let them erupt into flames that continuously seeped into the depths of his flames and the limits of his power. Only then could such flames be ignited. After that, he even needed to suppress his eternal will in order to guide the flames to undergo changes. Then, he would let the flames that continuously seeped into the depths of his body, wanting to completely ignite the flames inside and outside of his body. If there was any negligence, what awaited him would be the flames seeping into the depths of his heart, seeping into the depths of his life, and completely burning him. During this process, the great emperor's body constantly trembled. His resistance to the thunderbolts that accompanied the flames was even weaker than the first wave of thunderbolt. His entire body withstood the impact over and over again. Tiny fragments of his body continuously flew in all directions, and then disappeared among the flames and thunderbolts, turning into nothingness. This wave of thunderbolts and fire attack took the great emperor several hours to endure. Chapter 23-28. The tribulations that the great Tharch had suffered were almost endless. After enduring one wave, another wave would come. In just 9 days and 9 nights, the tribulations that he had encountered had already exceeded 10,000 waves, and every wave of tribulations was close to the great Thearcha's limit. Every time, it made him suspect that he would die in this tribulation and turn into ashes. However, just as Luo Fan had expected, the great Thearcha's potential was simply too strong. If he wasn't killed instantly, he would directly trigger a great potential in the depths of his body and mind, allowing his realm and strength to increase. In just a short 9 days and 9 nights, his strength had increased by more than 100 times compared to before the tribulation. Although he was still a pseudo-sage stage 9 and had yet to break through this realm and step into the pseudo-sage stage, he was clearly a big step closer to becoming a pseudo-sage. It was also because of this continuously erupting potential that he encountered such waves of tribulations that contained the characteristics of the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Although it was difficult, he could endure it every time. As long as it was a tribulation, there would be a limit. Either he could endure the corresponding time, endure the corresponding attacks, or break through the corresponding shackles. He would be able to transcend the tribulation and successfully transcend it. Be it the heavenly tribulation, earthly tribulation, human tribulation that Luo Fan had experienced, or the great tribulation that he was experiencing now, they were all the same. In fact, even the great tribulation of heaven and earth that completely targeted the world would not exceed this scope. Moreover, the great Tharch was currently experiencing a tribulation that targeted living beings. Naturally, it was impossible for it to exceed this scope. Therefore, when the great Thearcha's potential was stimulated again and again in the tribulation and he was improved again and again, it was only a matter of time before he transcended the tribulation. After 9 days and 9 nights, this was the final limit of the tribulation. When the last wave of endless lightning fell from the sky like raindrops and landed on the great emperor, it caused his body to tremble violently and the power in his body to dissipate crazily. It even caused his entire body to turn into light, as if he was going to turn illusory and disappear without a trace. However, in the end, it stimulated his potential even further. Not only did he recover, but he also pushed his cultivation realm forward. When he reached half a step into false saint, the tribulation clouds in the sky started to gradually dissipate. As the tribulation cloud dissipated, the strange barrier that had originally confined the space within a radius of 10,000 kilometers and completely separated it from the outside world disappeared without a trace. As the surroundings returned to normal, in the eyes of ordinary living beings and cultivators, the great monarch reappeared in the world. At the same time, all sorts of mysterious fluctuations appeared in the void. Like rivers flowing into the sea, they frantically gathered towards the great Thearcha's body. As these fluctuations gathered, countless immortal chants faintly came from the great Thearcha's body, as if there were countless supreme powerhouses chanting and praying for him in his body. As these changes occurred, the great Thearcha's life essence began to transition. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the last half-step. From the half-step false saint that he had achieved after the last wave of tribulation, he had directly stepped into the true false saint level. At the same time, endless rays of light suddenly appeared in the sky. This multicolored light was so sacred, so transcendent. It felt as if even the ugliest thing had become sacred under this multicolored light. Even the most ordinary scenery seemed to be endowed with endless truths and profoundness. Along with this light, there were countless immortal chants drifting in the void, drilling into the ears of all living beings and into their hearts, causing all living beings to feel that something important had happened in this world and was closely related to them. Along with the immortal chants, heavenly flowers floated down from the void, landing on the ground, on the plants, and on the heads of living beings. No matter what it was, whether it was a living thing or an inanimate object, whether it had intelligence or instinct, all existences seemed to have absorbed some kind of indescribable nutrients the moment they came into contact with the heavenly flowers. They began to produce some kind of inexplicable sublimation and obtain some kind of indescribable evolution. For a moment, the entire world fell into silence. Even those living beings with the mark of destruction were suppressed at this moment. They finally obtained the spirituality that belonged to living beings that had never appeared in their previous lives in this atmosphere. It was as if the atmosphere of the entire world had suddenly changed. It was as if the original human world had become the Taoist field of a supreme being. All living beings lost their sense of time during this process. After an unknown amount of time, when everything gradually calmed down, an uncontrollable instinct made all living beings in the world, apart from Luo Fan, kneel in a certain direction. They worshipped with great sincerity and cried out, "Congratulations to the Emperor for becoming a saint! Congratulations to the Emperor for becoming a saint!" The cries rang out from all over the world. Through some indescribable and mysterious path, they reached the place where the Emperor was located, almost at the end of the world. The laws, time, space, and even the great Tao in the area were stirred. Amidst the devout cries that sounded like the declaration of the world, the Emperor seemed to become more and more sacred. He really did look like a supreme saint sitting on a supreme throne. In that instant, the great Emperor felt as though he was connected to the entire heaven and earth. The great Tao that was originally untraceable and the will of the world that he originally did not know about completely appeared in his senses at this moment. A feeling of omniscience, and omnipotence arose spontaneously. "So, this is the saint," he murmured. He did not seem to make any movements, but the area that was originally extremely distorted and chaotic because it was near the end of the world was suddenly completely flattened. All the distortions disappeared in an instant, and everything returned to how it had been in the central continent. Whether it was the distortions of time and space, the laws, or the great Tao, they all completely disappeared with his thoughts. Moreover, after the distortions in this area subsided, the awkwardness and disharmony that should have appeared between this place and the other areas did not appear at all. On the contrary, everything seemed so natural. It was as if this place was born to be different from the other areas, as if it was completely unaffected by the distortions caused by the mist at the end of the world. Endless information surged into his heart at this moment. Everything that had happened since the world was born, and even most of the events that would happen from now to the distant future appeared in his heart in an instant. It was as if he had personally experienced everything in an instant, and he instantly understood everything. So, the great calamity of the world will descend in 490 million years. I didn't expect the tribulation to be so terrifying, and I would have to pay such a huge price to get through it, he murmured, and his eyes shone with infinite wisdom. It was as if there was an infinite amount of information flowing wildly through his eyes. A kind of pity and sorrow that had never appeared in his eyes before gradually emerged in his eyes. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure instantly traversed a distance of billions of light years. From the end of the world, he directly arrived at the central mainland and appeared in his original palace. This palace was high up in the void, as if it stood side by side with the sun and moon. In the many years that he had left, the palace had been hidden there. There was no aura or movement at all, and it maintained a deathly stillness. It was precisely because the palace was so deathly still and did not emit light like when the great monarch existed in the past, that all living beings truly believed that the great monarch had already disappeared. At this moment, the moment the great monarch returned to the palace, it began to release an unimaginable brilliance. It was a brilliance that was thousands of times more powerful than the brilliance it had released before he left. If the palace had only seemed to stand side by side with the sun and moon back then, now, the brilliance it gave off could stand side by side with the sun and moon. This brilliance was so mysterious, so profound. Under the illumination of the brilliance, all living beings seemed to have returned to the time when they were enveloped by the brilliance that appeared out of nowhere. They felt so warm all over as if they had returned to their mother's womb. An indescribable sense of security emerged from the bottom of their hearts and completely enveloped them, making them all calm down. After a while, the quasi-saints who stood at the peak of all living beings were the first to react. They put down what they were doing or what they should be doing and quickly rushed to the great monarch's palace from all over the central mainland to seek an audience with the great monarch who had suddenly returned. He seemed to be the source of all the strange phenomena that had happened before. "Greetings, great monarch." After a series of greetings, the dozens of quasi-saints stood in the palace and stood below the great monarch's throne. Before they came, they wanted to ask the great monarch why he had broken his promise and reappeared at this moment. However, when they saw the great monarch, they realized that they could not bring themselves to ask that question at all. He couldn't even express himself tactfully. There was no other reason than that the great monarch before them was too transcendent, too sacred, too noble, and too supreme. Just by sitting there, he had already given these quasi-saints a feeling that he was the end of the great Tao and the ultimate goal that they pursued. They even felt that he was the creator of this world, the controller of the river of time, and the pioneer of the future. Under this feeling, their own intelligence, their own will, their own knowledge, their own experience, and their own cultivation all seemed so small and insignificant. Let alone questioning the great monarch, even the thought that the great monarch might make a mistake was already unimaginably absurd to them. They felt that they had been bewitched to have such a thought. How could they question the great monarch when they were in such a state of mind? Naturally, they could only quietly stand under the great monarch's throne and obediently listen to the great monarch's admonition. The great emperor was well aware of this development, so he was not surprised at all by the behavior of the quasi-saints. Instead, he accepted their subjugation as a matter of course. He then said, "From today onwards, all of you will stop what you've been doing and purposely create conflicts. Begin to work together and gather all your strength. In 3,200 years, chaotic creatures will descend. They are the remnants of the last catastrophe and also the beginning of the next one. If you don't work together to deal with it, all living beings will perish." Hearing this, these quasi-saints were completely convinced by the great monarch's words. Their expressions changed greatly. He hurriedly agreed. At this moment, the great monarch continued, although your cultivation realms have improved, you've taken the wrong path. In 3 years, I will lecture about the truth here. There are 3,000 slots, which are in line with the 3,000 truths. You must choose the candidates carefully. Go. As he spoke, he waved his hand and the dozens of quasi-saints were enveloped by a terrifying power that they couldn't defend against. In a flash, they were brought out of the palace and out of the palace. At this moment, the dozens of quasi-saints finally realized what the great monarch had said. They were all excited and inexplicably excited. They exchanged glances and saw endless anticipation and doubt in each other's eyes. They were looking forward to the truth that the great monarch, who was countless times more powerful than before, would lecture 3 years later. They were doubtful because the great monarch said that they had taken the wrong path. Amidst the anticipation and doubt, they returned to their respective camps and began to follow the great monarch's orders to stop all conflicts with other camps. The original conflicts between different camps were resolved in a swift and decisive way. It was like taking drastic measures to directly cut off the source of chaos between different camps. Naturally, the process would not be too smooth. After all, after such a long period of fighting, individuals who originally had no conflicts had formed conflicts because of the various losses and injuries suffered in the war. Those who originally had no enmity with each other had accumulated irreconcilable enmity due to various reasons. Obviously, all of this could no longer be erased by an order from a higher-up, however. Regardless of the world, power and strength represented almost everything. These quasi-saints had the strength to suppress all the cultivators and subordinates in their respective camp. They even had the intelligence to suppress them. How could their subordinates resist them? Chapter 23-29. He seems to have completely forgotten about me. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he observed everything in the palace that was in between reality and illusion. The he was referring to was naturally the Great Tharch from the very beginning. He had seen everything that the Great Tharch had experienced. In fact, compared to the Great Tharch who could only obediently endure the endless tribulations that descended from the sky, he had even sensed more things and experienced more profound secrets. In that tribulation, the Great Tharch only felt that the world was testing him. On the other hand, he could clearly feel that there was some kind of conflict in this world. It was a conflict of whether to completely erase the Great Tharch or treat him as his greatest reliance and the greatest carrier of his power. It was precisely because of this conflict that the tribulations had appeared in such a situation. This was also the reason why the Great Tharch was able to pass this tribulation so easily in just 9 days and 9 nights. Not only did he pass it safely, but his cultivation realm had also improved greatly and he had directly stepped into the false saint stage. Otherwise, with how the world could easily mince the original Luo Fan into countless pieces and the power of a certain abstract attribute of a cultivation technique, how could there be a need for that kind of tribulations to erase the Great Tharch? Just a slight change would be enough to completely erase the Great Tharch, and there wouldn't even be any phenomenon. What exactly is it conflicted about? Sensing the conflict of the world, Luo Fan had an inexplicable doubt in his heart. One must know that the will of the world was an existence that was on the same level as a true sage. Although such an existence's way of existence was fundamentally different from that of ordinary living beings, it would not attack some living beings in the way that living beings treated other living beings. Instead, it would only treat the living beings it wanted in a way that was more similar to how the world treated living beings. However, it still had such a huge foundation of power and terrifying power. It only needed to use extremely simple methods to erase everything that went against it. Under such circumstances, what else did it need to be conflicted about? Could it be? With a thought, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable guess. Thinking of this speculation, his expression could not help but become serious. If this guess was wrong, then it was fine. But if this guess was correct, then the situation couldn't get any worse. With a thought, he observed the great emperor, who had completely forgotten about him, even more carefully. At this moment, the great emperor was sitting on his throne. His aura spread out and swept across the entire heaven and earth. He could sense the rules of the entire heaven and earth, time, space, and even the great Tao. At every moment, he was deepening his connection with this world. He was absorbing the nutrients he needed to grow from the depths of this world, and he was gaining all kinds of comprehension he needed to improve his cultivation. As he moved like this, his cultivation level was climbing at every moment. As for his strength, it was growing at every moment, constantly advancing towards the depths of the false sage realm. As he improved, his palace seemed to become more and more profound. The high and mighty aura that it gave off, overlooking and suppressing everything, became more and more powerful and shocking. In fact, it was precisely because of the changes in the hall that the demi-saints were able to suppress their subordinates and separate the living beings who were originally in a frenzy of killing, forcefully suppressing the conflicts and enmity between them. After all, the palace was constantly giving off this aura that had never existed before, which meant that the world had undergone a drastic change. Under such circumstances, the behavior of the quasi-sanctums that they could not understand was very likely to be caused by this change. Once they violated it, they might suffer unimaginable misfortune. With this thought, it was naturally easier for them to follow the orders of the quasi-saints and suppress the killing intent that they thought they could never suppress. 3 years passed in a flash. Very soon, the dozens of quasi-saints arrived outside the emperor's palace with their subordinates, a total of 3,000 cultivators. They were waiting for the emperor, who had become a false sage, to open the palace and welcome them in to listen to the truth. It was clearly not easy to select these 3,000 cultivators in just 3 years. Everything would definitely not go smoothly. There would definitely be many twists and turns, many battles and many schemes. However, these were clearly insignificant in the eyes of the true higher-ups. At the very least, whether it was the emperor or Luo Fan, none of them would care about what happened. In their eyes, there was only the original order and the 3,000 cultivators who appeared here in the end, along with the dozens of sage-to-be. As the 3,000 people gathered, the door of the palace opened. A vast space filled with immortal mist appeared in front of everyone. Compared to before, this palace was much more ethereal and transcendent. Just looking at it made one feel relaxed and happy, and one's cultivation faintly felt as if it had undergone some sort of subtle improvement. However, compared to their surroundings, all the cultivators immediately focused their attention on the throne in the center, where a supreme being was sitting quietly. What kind of being was that? Just by sitting there, he seemed to be the center of the universe. It was as if all the rules and laws of the universe originated from his hands. His calm 3 eyes seemed to contain the deepest, broadest, and most vast truths that they could imagine. Apart from that, what shocked everyone the most was that there was an absolutely real aura lingering around the Supreme Being. Under the illumination of this real aura, everything that they thought was real became illusory. Regardless of whether it was their surroundings, themselves, or even everything in their hands, everything in their memories, even this part of the world, became blurry and illusory. Truth? Is this the truth? For a moment, the same thought flashed across the minds of all the cultivators who knew why they were here. An indescribable desire emerged from the bottom of their hearts, and their eyes became fanatical. Everyone eagerly entered the palace and sat on the futons hidden in the immortal mist according to the order of strength. The great emperor glanced at the crowd below and confirmed the number of people before he said, "In 3,197 years, chaotic creatures will descend and cleanse the world. At that time, if you can't comprehend the truth, you'll be helpless before them. Therefore, you must remember the truth that I'm going to talk about." Hearing this, everyone couldn't help but be solemn. Even the dozens of sage-to-be became much more serious at this moment. After all, What the emperor was going to say was something that they hadn't heard before. Without understanding the truth, they would be helpless against those creatures of chaos. What exactly were those creatures of chaos? What was the truth? Why couldn't they do anything to them without understanding the truth? Since they couldn't do anything to them without understanding the truth, why did they only need 3,000 people to listen to the truth? If that was the case, wouldn't they have to deal with those creatures of chaos after 3,197 years? For a moment, all kinds of questions kept appearing in their minds, causing the look in their eyes to change slightly. For the emperor, who had completely stepped into the false sage stage, he clearly grasped the thoughts of all the living beings in this palace. Naturally, he knew the countless doubts in the hearts of these living beings at this moment. However, he didn't care about this at all. He just started to preach his so-called truth. Words that were extremely mysterious, wonderful, complicated, and magical, and contained endless truths and mysteries were constantly spat out of his mouth. They appeared in the void and evolved into all kinds of indescribable things, causing many living beings to instantly put aside all the doubts and suspicions they had previously and wholeheartedly integrate into the various words, patterns, and runes that the emperor was spitting out at this moment. The truth that the emperor was preaching was an extremely peculiar cultivation path that had almost nothing to do with the one that Luo Fan had passed on. In this cultivation path, there were also the abstract attributes that were transformed from Luo Fan's fragment. At this moment, as he preached, Luo Fan, who was watching from the side, kept extracting the abstract attributes and fusing them with his body, quickly repairing the fragments that had been lost due to his body being scattered. Compared to the fragments that he had spent a lot of effort to gather, the cultivation paths and cultivation methods that the great emperor spat out contained even more fragments, and they were even larger in number. In just a few days, he had completed the number of fragments that would have taken millions of years to collect. He had restored half of the fragments that were originally less than 1/3. With the return of this fragment, he felt that his cultivation realm had crossed a certain limit and directly stepped into the despair realm. This had already far surpassed the pseudo-saint realm. If he was compared to the emperor, he had already surpassed it by 2 levels. After all, if the emperor wanted to become a desperation realm, he still needed to transcend the restrictions of this world. Only after he was no longer bound by the shackles of this world would he be qualified to pursue breaking through the false sage stage and become a desperation realm. In other words, it was obviously 2 levels. The moment his cultivation realm increased, his aura became more and more ethereal. The hall that was originally untraceable became more and more illusory, obscure, and untraceable. If the great emperor from before had the chance to discover his location, or even break through some invisible restrictions to find him directly, then the great emperor from before had the chance to do so. But now, unless Luo Fan wanted to see him, he wouldn't be able to do so even if he risked his life. It seems that the possibility of my previous guess is higher. Feeling his changes, Luo Fan didn't feel too happy. Instead, he became more and more solemn. At this moment, in the great emperor's hall, the 3,000 cultivators had also obtained great benefits from the content of his speech. Although these cultivators already possessed considerable strength, and some had even vaguely formed their own unique Tao of cultivation. However, their initial growth was built by their own fumbling around. After listening to Luo Fan's cultivation method, they had only summarized the cultivation methods of many other cultivators to make up for their own Tao of cultivation. It could be said that fundamentally, the perfection of these cultivation methods was extremely poor. Although this kind of extremely poor cultivation method was enough for them to obtain their current abilities and obtain the power to decide the situation of this world, from a higher level, this kind of extremely poor cultivation method was obviously not enough to complete their historical mission in the future. This was also the fundamental reason why the great emperor was preaching this true Tao to them at this moment. Compared to the various paths of cultivation that they had created themselves, The so-called true path that the great emperor had preached was far more powerful than their own paths of cultivation, be it in terms of perfection or compatibility with the world. From a broader point of view, cultivating the Tao of cultivation of these cultivators was equivalent to developing their own potential, developing the limitless potential contained within their bodies. However, the true Tao that the great emperor was preaching now was using the power of this world. Borrowing the power of this world. Developing one's own potential, could indeed make one stronger. However, in terms of exertion, in terms of scale of power, it ultimately couldn't compare to using the power of heaven and earth. The power of heaven and earth, after all, compared to living beings, heaven and earth itself was much more vast and powerful. Even if one fully stimulated one's own potential and detonated it, the power that could be released in the end couldn't even compare to the power of an ordinary weather change in this world. In other words, to develop one's own potential and exert it to the fullest, one might not be able to exert the power of heaven and earth that could be mobilized with just 1% of the effort. In addition, after borrowing the power of heaven and earth, the degree of integration with heaven and earth would be greatly improved.